Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. I had just moved to the city, a place known for its fast pace, crowded streets, and never-ending buzz. But there was something I hadn't expected. Hidden beneath the surface of this bustling metropolis was a dark secret. One evening, after finishing work late, I decided to take the subway home. It was quieter than usual, the rush hour long past. I stood on the platform waiting for the train when I noticed an old section of the subway tunnel that seemed different from the rest. The walls were cracked, the tiles missing, the overhead lights flickering sporadically. I'd never seen this part of the station before. I assumed it was a closed-off section, probably part of an old renovation. But the further I looked down the tunnel, the more it felt wrong. The train arrived, and I stepped on, but something was off. The usual commuters weren't there, only a few scattered people. As the train rumbled through the dark tunnels, I caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure standing by the edge of the platform. I blinked. Nothing was there. I tried to shake it off. Then, a strange sound. The train screeched to a halt and the lights blinked out. The emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in a blood-red glow. I looked around, and I was the only one left on the train. The doors opened. A low hum echoed through the tunnel. I wasn't sure why I stepped off the train, but something felt urgent, as if something was pulling me forward. I wandered down. The platform. The only sound, my footsteps against the cold concrete. The air felt heavier, colder, and the silence around me was suffocating. I reached the end of the platform where a narrow, dimly lit passage led deeper into the tunnels. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, but I kept walking. I walked for what felt like an eternity, the passage stretching further than it should have. Then I saw it. A door. It was old, rusted, its paint peeling away. I couldn't explain why, but I reached for the handle and pulled. The room beyond was wrong. It was a maintenance room, but it was in disrepair, filled with dust and old equipment that had long been forgotten. On the wall, there was a large map of the subway system, but there was something strange about it. New lines had been added, lines that didn't exist. Lines leading to places that had no names, and then I heard it. A soft, low whisper, like someone calling my name. I spun around, but no one was there. The whisper came again, louder this time, closer, like it was right behind me. I turned to flee, but as I stepped back into the tunnel, the door slammed shut behind me. The lights flickered again, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone or something was coming toward me. It wasn't the slow shuffle of a person. It was the swift, deliberate steps of something much worse. I ran. My heart pounded as I sprinted down the tunnel, the hum of electricity vibrating through the walls. The whispers turned into shouts, now all around me. The sound of footsteps echoed louder and louder, chasing me. I reached the next platform and slammed into the first train I could find, the doors barely opening in time. I jumped inside, gasping for breath. The train pulled away, and the whispers faded. When I finally made it to my stop, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder. The platform was empty. The subway station looked normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me from deep within the tunnels. As the train pulled away, I saw it again, just a flash in the corner of my eye. The shadow, standing on the platform, watching me leave. Subway had its secrets, and some of them, I realized, were waiting to be found. I've always had a soft spot for abandoned places. It's the thrill of walking through forgotten history, seeing what people left behind. So when a friend mentioned an old, abandoned mall on the edge of a town, I couldn't resist. The place had been closed for years, but rumors about it kept circulating. People said it was haunted. that strange noises echoed through the empty halls, but I didn't believe in any of that. On a Saturday afternoon, I gathered a few friends and we drove out there. The mall was hidden behind overgrown trees and bushes, almost as if nature was trying to swallow it whole. The front doors were locked, but we found an old service entrance on the side, rusted and barely hanging on its hinges. It creaked loudly as we pushed it open, stepping into the darkness. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The lights had long since burned out, leaving only the faint light from our flashlights to guide us. The halls were eerily silent, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the cracked tiles. We explored floor after floor, the stale air growing heavier with each step. Stores that once sold clothes, books, electronics, now stood empty. Signs hung crooked, some falling off entirely. Broken windows let in streams of moonlight, casting shadows that seemed to move in the corner of our eyes. But I ignored the creeping unease. That was until we came across the food court. It was like stepping into a forgotten world. The tables and chairs were still there, though they were covered in a thick layer of dust. A faded sign for a long-defunct fast food chain hung above the counter. But what caught my attention was the strange sound. Soft, barely audible, but definitely there. It was a faint tapping. At first I thought it was just the wind, but when I turned to my friends, they all looked just as confused. We walked further into the food court, and the tapping grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like something, or someone, was knocking on one of the old food stalls. I don't know what made me walk toward it, but I did. My heart was pounding in my chest as I approached the stall where the sound seemed to be coming from. The tapping had stopped, but the air around me felt heavy, suffocating. I lifted my flashlight, and when the beam hit the counter, I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then I saw it move, slowly, as though it was watching me. A shape hunched over with a pale, featureless face. The tapping resumed, louder now, coming from where the figure's hands were, rhythmically hitting the counter. It was as if it was beckoning me closer, daring me to step into its world. I turned to my friends, ready to leave, but they were frozen, staring at something behind me. I spun around, the hairs on my neck standing up. The figure had moved closer, now standing right in front of the counter. It didn't make a sound, just watched me with those empty, unblinking eyes. Before I could react, the sound of the doors slamming shut echoed through the mall. We rushed toward the entrance, but the door wouldn't open. Panic set in. My flashlight flickered, casting the hall into complete darkness for a split second. In that moment, I heard the tapping again, but now it was coming from everywhere. Dozens of hands, all tapping in perfect unison. Then the lights above us flickered to life, and the figure was gone. But the knocking didn't stop. We bolted. The door finally gave way with one last desperate shove, and we ran into the night without looking back. The mall stood silent behind us, as if nothing had ever happened. But the tapping stayed in my mind, a constant rhythm that I couldn't escape. I don't know what was in that mall, but I know one thing for sure. Some things should stay forgotten. I moved into the apartment building in a hurry. It wasn't exactly my first choice, but the rent was cheap and I needed a place fast. The building itself had that old, neglected look. Cracked floors, peeling wallpaper, the kind of place where you'd expect the smell of mildew in every hallway. But, desperate, I signed the lease without a second thought. On the first night, I was unpacking when I noticed something strange. From the corner of my living room, I could hear a low thud. At first, I brushed it off as the sound of old pipes, maybe a neighbor dropping something. But then it happened again. Louder this time. Thud, thud, thud. I turned toward the floor beneath me, where the noise seemed to be coming from, and realized that no one lived in the apartment below mine. The place had been vacant for months, the landlord told me. No one to make those noises. I thought maybe it was the building settling, so I ignored it. But the thuds didn't stop. Each night they grew more insistent. And then I started hearing something else, scratching sounds, like nails dragging across the floor. I tried to sleep through it, but the sound was too unsettling. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs to check the empty apartment. The hallway smelled musty, the kind of smell you get when something hasn't been touched for years. When I reached the door to the apartment, I hesitated. What if it was just a problem with the building's structure? But I had to know. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The room inside was dark, colder than the rest of the building. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the shadows, and immediately felt something off. The air felt too thick, like something was watching me from the corners. As I walked deeper into the room, my heart started to race. The sound of scratching was louder now, echoing in the silence. I followed it to the far corner of the room. The flashlight illuminated an old wooden chest, half buried under dust and cobwebs. My breath caught in my throat. There was something inside it. I knelt down, my hands trembling. Slowly, I lifted the chest's lid. The scratching stopped. Inside was a bundle of old, yellowed rags, but as I moved them aside, I found something else. A hand. Pale, emaciated, and stiff with rigor mortis, it was reaching out from beneath the fabric as if someone had been trying to escape. I stumbled back in shock, my flashlight falling to the floor, its beam dancing across the room before going dark. The scratching started again, louder now, coming from every direction. I scrambled to my feet, panic rising in my chest. The door slammed shut behind me. I tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My breath came in short gasps as I pounded against the door, but it didn't open. Then, through the darkness, I heard something far worse than the scratching. A voice, barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze. "Leave now," the voice rasped, barely audible. I didn't think. I ran. I slammed against the door again, but this time it opened and I fled back to my apartment. Sounds of scraping and whispering following me. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up, terrified, waiting for the sounds to stop. But they didn't. The thuds, the scratching, the voice, they followed me, no matter where I went in the building. The next morning, I went to the landlord to explain what had happened. His face went pale when I described the apartment below. You weren't supposed to go down there," he said. "There's someone, or something, that lives there now." He told me the story of the last tenant, a man, desperate, who had vanished without a trace years ago. The landlord said the building had always had a strange history, but they'd never spoken of it. The apartment remained vacant after that. No one ever stayed longer than a few days. No one, that is, except for whatever was below, waiting. I left the building the very next day. I don't know who or what was in that apartment below mine, but whatever it was, it followed me. And I can still hear the scratching sometimes, even now. I wasn't supposed to go inside. Everyone warned me. The place had been abandoned for over 30 years, but the stories were still fresh in the town. There were rumors about the asylum, the ones about the tortured souls who never left, the dark history that seeped into the very walls. But I was a thrill seeker, always pushing boundaries. When I found an open window on the second floor, I couldn't resist. It was late afternoon when I climbed in, the air thick and musty, a far cry from the crisp air outside. The halls were eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the building. Settling. Dust coated everything. Old medical equipment, tattered chairs, and peeling wallpaper. There was a lingering smell, like rot mixed with something metallic. I made my way down a long corridor, the floorboards groaning under my weight. My flashlight flickered as I walked, its beam cutting through the shadows that seemed to stretch, unnaturally long. It was too quiet, too still. The first room I opened was a patient's bedroom, rusted bed frames and old, faded furniture. But it was the walls that caught my attention. Scratches, deep gouges carved into the plaster, some so fresh they seemed to shimmer in the light. I shuddered. It wasn't just the damage that unsettled me. It was the idea that someone, or something, had done this. As I ventured deeper into the building, I noticed something strange. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the walls themselves were exhaling. My flashlight began to flicker, so I tried to turn it off and on again, but it wouldn't stay lit for more than a few seconds. Panic crept in, then I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, then louder, as though coming from all directions at once. "Leave." I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I looked around, but there was no one. Only the emptiness of the asylum. I stepped back toward the hallway, but that's when I saw it. The door at the far end of the hall, which had been closed when I entered, was slowly creaking open, as if inviting me in. I tried to ignore the creeping sense of dread that washed over me, but curiosity pushed me forward. I took a step, then another, each one heavier than the last. The whisper came again, this time clearer. "Don't open it." But my hand was already on the doorknob. It turned with an unsettling squeak. I stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from my malfunctioning flashlight, but what caught my attention were the photographs on the walls. Old black and white images of the asylum's former patients, all of them staring straight ahead, their eyes hauntingly vacant, except for one. A young woman, her eyes wide with terror, staring directly at the camera. I shuddered, stepping closer to the photo, when suddenly my flashlight flickered one last time and went out. In the pitch black, I heard it again. Only, this time, it wasn't a whisper. A soft, slow scratching. From behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just the silence, heavy and thick. Yet the scratching continued, this time louder, more frantic. It was coming from the walls, from beneath the floorboards. I backed out of the room, my breath shallow. The air felt thick with something ancient, like the building was alive, watching, waiting. I stumbled down the hallway, my hands trembling as I tried to find the way out. But the further I went, the more the shadows seemed to stretch, folding into themselves like they were swallowing the light. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction I had just left. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My heart raced as I sprinted toward the exit, my mind numb with fear. But the door I had entered through was gone. Just a solid wall where it had once been. I was trapped. The footsteps stopped. I could feel a presence behind me. Something too close, its breath cold against my neck. Then, in a voice that wasn't a whisper but a growl, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come. I don't know how I got out." One moment I was running through the asylum's halls, and the next I was outside, gasping for air, my heart threatening to burst. I never went back to that place, but sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can still hear the scratching and the whisper. Leave. I had been traveling for work, and after a long drive through a rural area, I finally reached my destination, a rundown hotel that barely had a sign. It was a small 2-story building, surrounded by overgrown grass and a weathered parking lot. As I walked in, the smell of stale air and old carpet hit me. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman, handed me a key without a word. The room was basic, with faded wallpaper and a single flickering light above the bed. I didn't expect much, just a place to sleep before heading out again in the morning. But as I unpacked my things, something caught my attention. The mirror on the wall was cracked, stretching from one corner to the other in a jagged line. I shrugged it off. It was an old hotel, after all. I threw myself onto the bed, exhausted from the road. As I lay there, I noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror wasn't quite right. The lighting in the room was dim, but the reflection in the mirror showed a much brighter light behind me, even though there were no lights on in the hallway. It almost looked like someone was standing there. I turned quickly to check, but the hallway was empty. Still, the reflection in the mirror remained unchanged, bright and shadowy figures moving just out of sight. My pulse quickened. I stepped toward the mirror, staring at it more intently now. The reflection seemed to shift, as though it was alive. I blinked, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, but when I looked again, there was something more visible. In the reflection, a figure, tall, thin, dressed in a long coat, standing just behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The room was empty. I ran my hand over the cracked glass, trying to steady my nerves. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, like fingertips brushing against the glass from the other side. The sound echoed in the quiet room. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. The mirror wasn't just reflecting the room. It was something more, something else. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. The figure in the mirror shifted closer to me, its face now visible. I froze. The face was pale, gaunt, its eyes dark and hollow, staring directly at me. I reached for my phone to call the front desk, but the screen flickered and went black. In the mirror, the figure smiled, wide, unnaturally wide, as though it had been waiting for me to notice it all along. I could hear its laughter, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It sounded distorted, like it was coming from deep inside the glass itself. Panicking, I slammed my hand against the wall, trying to find the switch for the light. The mirror's reflection darkened, and the figure stepped out of it, moving closer to me. Its steps were slow but deliberate. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, I grabbed my things, rushed to the door, and threw it open. I didn't care about anything else. I had to get out of there. But as I stepped into the hallway, I was met by the receptionist. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, as though she had been waiting for me. "You should never stay in that room," she said, her voice shaky. I turned back to the room, expecting to see the door behind me swing closed, but instead it was wide, open. The mirror was completely gone. "What do you mean?" I stammered. She didn't respond. She simply stared at me, then motioned toward the elevator. "It's better you leave now. The room doesn't like visitors." I didn't stay for another second. I grabbed my things and left the hotel, the sound of tapping following me out into the night. I never learned the true story behind that room, but I knew one thing. The mirror was never just a mirror. It was a late-night commute that I would never forget. I'd missed the last train home after work, so I was stuck at a nearly deserted station. The old building was dimly lit, with flickering overhead lights that barely illuminated the benches, and ticket booths. A faint hum echoed in the air, like the sound of machinery left running too long. I was alone, or so I thought. I glanced at the schedule board. The next train wasn't due for over an hour, so I took a seat on one of the worn benches. My phone had no signal and the battery was running low. I tried to relax, but the uneasy quiet started to get to me. I glanced around. Empty platforms, nothing but a few forgotten bags left behind. Then I heard it. The soft click of footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. I frowned, chalking it up to my tired mind playing tricks on me. The station had an eerie vibe, especially when it was so empty. I tried to ignore the strange feeling creeping over me, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at the clock, 10:45 p.m. Where was the security guard? Shouldn't someone be around this late? I stood up, walking toward the ticket booth to see if I could at least ask about the next train. As I walked through the dimly lit hallway toward the booth, I saw something strange out of the corner of my eye. There, at the end of the hallway, was a figure. A man standing completely still in front of a staircase leading down to the lower platforms. I froze. He wasn't moving, just standing there in a dark coat, staring ahead. I blinked, then looked. Again. He hadn't moved a muscle. I called out, "Hey, you okay?" No response. I was about to turn back, thinking he was just some lost commuter, when I heard it again. The soft click of footsteps, this time coming from the opposite direction. I spun around, expecting to see someone else, but there was no one. Only the sound of my heart pounding in my chest. My thoughts raced. Why was this station so silent? Then, without warning, the lights above me flickered once more, and I caught a glimpse of the man again. Only now, he was closer. Much closer. He hadn't moved, but he was now standing at the bottom of the stairs, his face hidden in shadow. The flickering light revealed something that made my stomach drop. There were no eyes, just two dark holes, where his face should be. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran back toward the platform, my footsteps echoing down the deserted hallway. But the moment I passed through the door to the platform, the air changed. Colder, heavier. The walls seemed to close in, and I could swear I heard a low, guttural whisper in the air, a sound that crawled up my spine. I glanced over my shoulder. The man was there again, standing just outside the door, his shadow stretching unnaturally long. I backed away, my breath quickening. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I pulled it out. Finally, a signal. I called a cab, nearly shaking with fear as I waited for the train to arrive. The minutes felt like hours. Every time I glanced toward the entrance, I saw the figure closer. Now. The whispering grew louder, indistinct voices mixing with the sound of my panicked breathing. Just as the train finally pulled into the station, the man took a step toward me. He didn't move like a person anymore. His body shifted unnaturally, almost as if it wasn't meant to walk on two legs. The whispering intensified, becoming a screeching noise that filled my head. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I rushed into the train, ignoring the strange looks from the few passengers already aboard. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I had narrowly escaped something. As the train pulled away, I dared to look back out the window. The station was dark, abandoned once again. But then, I saw him. Standing on the platform, staring at me with those empty holes where his eyes should have been. And in his hand, he held a ticket. My ticket. The train rattled on, but I couldn't stop shaking. I didn't take the train again for weeks, and I never looked at a station the same way again. I never believed in ghost stories, but all of that changed the night I stayed in the old hospital. It was a long-term care facility, the kind you only see in movies, run down, with flickering lights and an atmosphere thick with years of memories. The new owners were trying to renovate, but the place still felt haunted. I was a night shift nurse, new to the area, and my first assignment was to work at the hospital for the weekend. The place was mostly empty, save for a few elderly patients scattered across the rooms. They kept to themselves, some too weak to speak, others lost in their own worlds. The night started normally, with the sound of machines beeping and the occasional shuffle of staff. That was until I made my rounds to room 406, the farthest room on the floor. I had never been in that room before, and it felt strangely colder when I entered. The curtains were drawn, but a faint flickering light from the hallway made it difficult to see clearly. The bed was empty, yet the blankets were disturbingly disturbed, as if someone had been lying there recently. Confused, I checked the chart at the foot of the bed. No patient was listed for that room. I figured it was just a mistake, maybe a recently vacated space or a room the other nurses had forgotten to mark. I left it alone, deciding to do my other checks. But something nagged at me. It was a feeling, one I couldn't quite shake. I returned to room 406 about an hour later, and this time, the light in the room was on. The door was cracked open just enough for me to see a shadow moving inside. I called out, "Hello? Is someone in here?" No answer. I pushed the door open and immediately froze. There, standing by the window, was a figure. pale and gaunt, wearing an old-fashioned hospital gown. It wasn't one of the patients I'd seen earlier. This figure was different. The person's face was obscured, but I could feel their gaze locked on me. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the figure turned and walked toward the bed, its feet making no sound against the floor. Then, in one smooth motion, it disappeared. I rushed over to the bed, but it was empty again, the blankets smooth and undisturbed as if nothing had happened. I stood there, shaking, unsure of what to do. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the hospital's eerie atmosphere had gotten to me. I decided to leave the room and lock the door. But just as I was about to turn the key, the door creaked open behind me. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. Standing there, right at the threshold, was the figure again. This time, it stepped into the light, revealing its face. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted, silent scream on its face. Its mouth opened slightly as though to speak, but no sound came. I bolted out of the room, not looking back. I ran to the nurse's station and told my colleagues what happened, but when we returned to room 406, everything was normal. The bed was made, the lights were off, and the door was locked. The strange thing was, when we checked the log, we found that room 406 had been listed as unavailable for years. The hospital records showed no patient had ever stayed there. But that night, I swore I saw something, or someone, standing in that room, and I was certain it wasn't the only thing that lingered in that hospital. I was on a red-eye flight, exhausted but unable to sleep. The plane hummed softly, the dim cabin lights casting long shadows over rows of dozing passengers. Outside the window, the sky was an endless black void. No stars, no moon, just nothingness, stretching forever. Somewhere over the ocean, things changed. I glanced up and noticed the flight attendants standing eerily still in the aisle. Their faces were blank, eyes unfocused, bodies rigid. I thought maybe I was just overtired, but then I saw the other passengers. The ones who had been asleep a moment ago were now sitting upright, staring straight ahead, not moving, not blinking. A cold chill ran down my spine. The man next to me, who had been snoring for hours, was suddenly silent, too silent. His chest wasn't rising or falling. I nudged him slightly. His head turned toward me, too quickly, too smoothly. His eyes were wide open, but they weren't right. They were empty. A slow, unnatural grin spread across his face. Shot up from my seat, heart pounding, and turned toward the flight attendants. One of them, a woman with perfect blonde hair and a crisp uniform, suddenly locked eyes with me. Her head tilted slightly, too sharp, too unnatural. "You should sit down," she said. Her voice didn't match her lips. It echoed, as if coming from somewhere else. I stumbled back. The entire cabin was wrong. The hum of the plane sounded distorted, almost reversed. The other passengers remained perfectly still, their eyes locked forward. Then, all at once, they turned to face me. Every single one. I ran toward the back of the plane, desperate to find a real person, someone normal. But as I passed each row, I realized their faces were changing. The passengers' features were melting, twisting into something inhuman. Their mouths stretched too wide, their eyes black and bottomless. A baby that had been crying earlier was now silent, its head turning impossibly far as I passed. I reached the back of the plane, my breath coming in short gasps. The door to the rear galley was slightly open. I pushed through, slamming it behind me. The small space was empty except for a single window. I pressed my forehead against it, trying to calm myself, but what I saw outside made my stomach drop. The plane wasn't moving. We weren't flying. We were just suspended in darkness. No clouds, no stars, no ground below, just an endless black void. Then I heard it. a slow, rhythmic tapping against the window. I turned, dreading what I would see. There was a face outside. It wasn't human. It had no eyes, only deep, empty sockets. Its mouth was too wide, grinning, stretching across its entire face. The thing pressed its long fingers against the glass, tilting its head as if studying me. I stumbled back. The door behind me burst open, and I was yanked back into the cabin. The passengers were no longer seated. They were standing, their heads all tilted at the same unnatural angle, their mouths opening in unison. The blonde flight attendant stepped forward. She smiled. "You should sit down," she repeated. Then everything went black. When I woke up, the plane had landed. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow through the windows. The passengers were gathering their things, chatting, stretching. Everything looked normal. Had I dreamed it? I reached for my bag, my hands still shaking. As I stood to leave, I glanced at my seatmate, the man who had been beside me the whole flight. He smiled, his mouth stretched just a little too wide. I'd just moved into a cheap apartment in a rundown building on the outskirts of the city. The rent was ridiculously low, so when I saw the listing, I didn't hesitate. The landlord, an older man with a deep, unsettling gaze, told me it was a quiet place. No noise, no trouble. The apartment was small, but it had a view of the alleyway behind the building, which was fine. The first few days were normal enough. I unpacked, got comfortable, and settled into my routine. But there was something strange about the place. A quiet hum filled the air at night, faint but constant. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but then I started hearing things. Footsteps above me when no one was up there. Whispers from the walls, muffled sounds I couldn't place. One evening, as I sat in my living room, I noticed something out of place. The door to the apartment next to mine, Apton 2B, was slightly ajar. I hadn't seen anyone go in or out for days, and it felt odd to see the door open like that. Curious, I walked over and knocked gently, but no answer came. I hesitated for a moment and then pushed the door open. The apartment was empty. The floors were dusty and the furniture had a layer of neglect to it. But there was something even more unsettling. The door to the bathroom was shut. I slowly approached it, heart pounding in my chest. When I pushed it open, I was met with darkness. The window was covered with old newspapers blocking any light. Then I saw it. A single red mark on the floor, like something had been dragged through it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I backed out quickly, closing the door with a shaky breath. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds from the walls were louder, now, scratching, tapping, like something was trying to get out. I got up and checked the hallway, but it was silent. When I returned to my apartment, I noticed a shadow at the edge of my vision, moving in the corner of the room. My pulse quickened. The next morning, I decided to go downstairs and ask the landlord about the strange apartment. He was in his office, his expression unreadable when I asked about 2B. "It's been vacant for a while," he said, his voice cold. "It's best if you stay away from that one. The last tenant, well, let's just say she left unexpectedly." I frowned, but he didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. I had seen enough. That night, as I lay in bed, the noises returned, louder than ever. A soft, distant cry followed by a sharp knock on my door. My heart raced. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to know what was waiting outside, but something pushed me. I opened the door to find the hallway dark, the light flickering. The air was thick, heavy, as if it had been waiting for me. And then I heard it, a whisper so close it sent chills through my body. "She's back." I whipped around, but there was nothing. I quickly shut the door, bolting it behind me. As the night wore on, the room grew colder and the noises intensified. Scratching, thumping, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Someone was walking down the hallway outside my door. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced through the peephole, but there was no one there. Just darkness. Then the footsteps stopped, and the air became eerily still. I couldn't stay. I grabbed my things and bolted from the apartment, not looking back. I ran down the stairwell, only to stop when I saw the landlord standing at the bottom, blocking the exit. His expression had changed. His eyes no longer held the same unsettling calm. They were wild, desperate. "You shouldn't have left," he said softly. "Now, you're part of the building." I turned to run the other way, but the hall seemed to stretch endlessly. The walls closed in around me, and I heard the same whisper, louder now. "She's back." Suddenly, I wasn't alone. The tenant, whoever she was there, standing in the hallway, her face twisted and pale, eyes hollow as if drained of all light. With one last scream, I ran toward the front door and threw myself out of the building, into the night air. I don't know how I escaped, but when I looked back, the building stood in silence, just as it had before. But I knew it was waiting. The landlord was gone. And Aptner 2B? It was still there, its door wide open, inviting anyone who would dare step in next, and I knew deep down the building would never let me go. I found the mirror in the attic of my new house, tucked behind an old wooden chest covered in dust. It wasn't anything special, just a full-length mirror with an ornate, faded gold frame. Still, I couldn't resist setting it up in my bedroom. It was one of those impulse decisions that seemed fine at the time, but later left me wondering why I'd done it. That night, I lay in bed, the soft hum of the house settling around me. The mirror reflected the faint glow of the moonlight that crept through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. As I stared at my reflection, something felt wrong. It was subtle at first, just a flicker, a shadow that seemed to move in the glass when it shouldn't have. I shook it off, thinking it was just the tiredness messing with my mind. But the next night, the feeling didn't go away. As I stood in front of the mirror brushing my teeth, I saw something I shouldn't have. My reflection wasn't matching my movements. I froze, watching in disbelief as the image of myself in the mirror smiled at me. It wasn't a smile I had made. My reflection grinned wide, eyes gleaming with something dark and malicious. I quickly turned away, heart hammering, and looked back. The reflection was back to normal, just like mine. That's when it started. The whispers. I'd hear them, soft and low, coming from the direction of the mirror. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the house settling, but then the whispers became words. Clear, distinct. They seemed to speak directly to me. Come closer. Look again. One night, unable to resist, I approached the mirror. My heart raced in my chest as I stood before it, staring at the glass. The whispering grew louder, and my reflection this time moved before I did, slowly raising its hand to touch the mirror. I reached out, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips, but the reflection's hand didn't stop at the glass. It pressed against it, and I felt a cold, unnatural pressure on my own hand as though something was pulling at me from the other side. Suddenly, the mirror shook violently. The whispering grew into frantic voices urging me to step forward. I stepped back, panic rising in my throat, but the reflection didn't stop. It stepped out of the glass. I gasped, stumbling backward. The figure before me was a twisted version of myself, its face distorted into an expression of rage, its eyes wide and wild. It was no longer human. It was something else. The reflection grinned, and that's when I understood. It wasn't my reflection at all. It had been waiting, watching, wanting to take my place. I turned and ran, but the figure followed me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I heard it laughing behind me, that twisted, mocking sound, echoing in the dark halls. In My panic, I tried to escape the house, but the door wouldn't open. I ran back toward the bedroom, my heart pounding. The figure was still there, standing in the doorway now, grinning wider, its eyes full of malice. "You can't escape," it whispered. "I've been waiting for so long." With a burst of adrenaline, I shoved past the figure and grabbed the mirror, yanking it from the wall with all my strength. I threw it onto the floor with a crash, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. The room went silent. I stood there, trembling, the broken shards reflecting bits of the room, fragments of myself scattered across the floor. The air felt different now, calmer, still. But then, from the shards, I heard it again, the whisper. "You can't escape." I rushed out of the house that night, leaving everything behind. I never looked back. I never spoke of it to anyone. But sometimes when I stand in front of a mirror, I see it in the corner of my vision, the twisted reflection, waiting for me to come too close. I never meant to go down there. It all started when we moved into the old house, an inherited property on the outskirts of town, the kind of house you only see in movies. Big, dark, and tucked into the woods, with creaky floors and rooms that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. We didn't have much money and it was cheap, so we took it. The house had a basement, but it was locked. The previous owners had left without explanation, and no one in town wanted to talk about it. But I was curious. One evening, after unpacking all day, I found the key hidden in a drawer. My heart raced as I held it in my hand, but I shrugged off my unease and made my way to the basement door. The wood was worn and the lock was rusty, but the key slid in perfectly. The door creaked open, releasing a gust of stale air that made me cough. The basement was dark, the only light coming from a bare bulb at the top of the stairs. The smell of damp wood and something more. Metallic filled the air. I hesitated, then stepped down. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, each step louder than the last. Halfway down, I noticed something strange. There was no floor at the bottom. The stairs led into a black void. My hand trembled on the railing, but I pushed forward. At the bottom, the air felt colder. I fumbled for the light switch, but when I flipped it, nothing happened. The light must have been burned out. I stood there in the dark, my heart pounding, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Suddenly, there was a creak behind me, followed by a soft whisper. I spun around but saw nothing. The darkness stretched endlessly in every direction, suffocating and oppressive. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. Then the whisper came again, closer this time. "Don't go down there." My blood ran, cold. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't in my head, I wasn't alone. I bolted up the stairs, heart pounding in my chest. The door slammed shut behind me and I stood, panting, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper in the wind, made my skin crawl, but the basement haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The darkness, the whispers. The next day, I decided to go back. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe the house had settled, or the wind had caused the noises. I made my way to the basement again. This time, I brought a flashlight. The door opened easily, and I stepped into the darkness. The air felt heavier, colder, like something was pressing against me from all sides. The beam of my flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the bare walls and wooden beams above. Then I saw it, a small staircase at the far end of the basement, hidden in the shadows. I hadn't noticed it before. The steps looked old, worn, like they hadn't been used in years. I walked toward them, my flashlight flickering in my hand. As I got closer, I felt a sudden rush of dread. The air grew colder, and the darkness at the top of the stairs seemed deeper, thicker. I stopped, suddenly unsure. "Don't go down there." It was the same whisper, the same voice. It sounded like it was coming from the shadows themselves. My heart raced and I took a step back, but my feet wouldn't obey. Before I knew it, I was climbing the stairs. Each step felt like a pull, an invisible force drawing me upward. The whisper grew louder, almost a growl. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The flashlight flickered out. I froze. The darkness closed in. I couldn't see a thing. The air was so cold, my breath came out in visible puffs, and I felt something moving around me, something brushing against my skin, like 1,000 unseen fingers. Then a figure appeared, a shadow, tall and thin, standing at the top of the stairs. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. It didn't move. It didn't speak, but it was there. I ran. I don't remember how I made it up the stairs or out of the basement. All I know is that I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, the sun burning my skin like it had never touched me before. I never went back down there. The basement door is still locked. But every night when the house is quiet, I can hear the whisper, "Don't go down there." And every night I wonder, what was waiting at the bottom of those stairs? What would have happened if I had kept going? I don't think I'll ever find out. I've always been the curious type, the kind of person who checks every nook and cranny when moving into a new place. So, when I first got the keys to my new apartment, I immediately began exploring every corner. The building was old, really old, filled with creaky floors, peeling paint, and that musty smell that always lingers in places untouched by time. It was late in the evening when I noticed something strange. A small, almost unnoticeable door in the back of the closet. It was hidden behind a stack of old boxes, and the knob was rusty. My heart raced as I ran my fingers over it. Why hadn't the landlord mentioned this? I pulled it open. It creaked loudly, more than I expected, and revealed a tiny, dark space. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a narrow crawl space, barely big enough for me to fit through. But there was something unsettling about the way the shadows clung to the walls. For some reason, I couldn't look away. The door had been closed for years, I was sure of it, but the air inside felt wrong. A sense of dread wrapped itself around my chest, squeezing tighter the longer I stared. I felt like something was watching me, and for a moment, I almost shut the door and pretended I hadn't seen it. But curiosity won. I grabbed a flashlight and squeezed through the opening. The space was cramped, and my knees scraped against the jagged edges of the walls. The flashlight flickered on and off, casting brief flashes of light on the crumbling wood around me. As I inched forward, I noticed a strange pattern carved into the walls. Symbols, marks that looked like they had been etched in a hurry, and some that seemed unnervingly fresh. Suddenly, I heard something soft, like a whisper. My heart skipped, and I froze. "Who's there?" I whispered into the darkness. No response. I pressed on, pushing through the suffocating air, my every movement feeling too loud. Then, just ahead, I noticed something. A figure, barely visible, standing in the far corner of the crawl space. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but as the light flickered again, I saw it clearer. A human shape, standing completely still, its face hidden in darkness. The hair on my neck stood up. "Hello?" I called again, but the figure didn't move. The whisper returned, louder this time. "Leave. Now." I turned around in a panic, only to realize I had no idea how to get back. The crawl space seemed to have stretched. What was once a short path now felt endless. My flashlight dimmed further, casting everything in a sickly glow. "Leave. Now. You found me." The voice came from behind me. I spun around and the figure had moved. It was no longer standing still. It was right in front of me, close enough that I could hear its breath. Slow, labored, wet. I backed away, my pulse pounding. The flashlight flickered once more, and in that moment of darkness, I felt it. The cold fingers of something brushing against my skin, something wet and cold, like flesh that had been submerged in ice water. I bolted forward, panic overtaking every sense. I scrambled back toward the entrance, but the space kept expanding, twisting. I couldn't find the way out. I kept running in circles, tripping over the uneven ground. Please, don't. The voice came again, but now it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream, echoing off the walls. I pushed harder, heart racing, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. If I did, I was sure I'd see it. The thing that had been watching me. Finally, the flashlight went out. The world plunged into darkness. The whispers became roars, a cacophony of sounds that twisted together, all calling my name, begging me to stop. I didn't. Then, just as quickly as it had started, I felt the crawlspace shift. I tumbled forward, crashing into the closet door, my hands scraping against the rough wood. The moment I pushed it open, I tumbled out into the room, gasping for air. The door slammed shut behind me, the darkness cutting off at once. I was back in my apartment. I didn't wait to take a breath. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "Is there anyone else in this building?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The landlord hesitated. "No. Why?" Then, who was in the walls? There was a long pause on the other end. "What are you talking about?" Who was watching me from the crawlspace?" I demanded, feeling panic rising in my throat. The line went dead. I tried calling back, but the number was disconnected. I couldn't explain what had happened, but something told me I wasn't alone in this building anymore. Later that night, I heard the whisper again, this time from inside the walls. "You found me. Now you belong to me." I moved into the apartment on the 3rd floor just a week ago. It was small, a bit run down, but cheap. I didn't mind. The landlord was an odd, quiet man, but he seemed harmless enough. He handed me the keys with a strange, lingering look. The building itself had an unsettling feel. Creaky floors, hallways that always seemed too quiet. I wasn't the only tenant, though. The other apartments were occupied by people who kept to themselves. It felt like the kind of place where you didn't ask too many questions. On the 3rd night, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but it was late, and I was too tired to ignore it. "Hello?" There was only silence on the other end. No breathing, no voice. Just a low, steady hum. I pulled the phone away from my ear and glanced at the screen. The call had disconnected. I shrugged. It off, maybe a wrong number. But then it happened again. Same time the next night. Same number. Same eerie silence. I tried to ignore it, but the calls didn't stop. Every night at the same hour. And each time the silence would drag on, the hum growing louder, like a distant growl. The weird thing was, there was no record of the calls. No missed calls, no log entries, nothing to show I'd ever received them. I grew paranoid. One night, I decided to answer it. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound calm. This time, there was a voice, a soft, raspy whisper. "Don't answer it again." I froze, the words sinking deep into my chest. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice shaky. The voice on the other end didn't reply. The hum grew louder. Then, just like that, the call ended. The next day, I decided to investigate. I went downstairs to speak with the landlord, hoping he could offer some explanation. He was sitting in his usual spot behind the desk, his eyes fixed on a stack of papers. "Do you know anything about these calls I've been getting?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He didn't look up. "You're not the first one." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He sighed and finally met my gaze. "Every tenant gets them. You won't be the last." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" He set down the papers, his expression serious. It's the apartment. It's cursed, I guess. The phone calls started long before you moved in. Some people say they hear things, whispers, growls, things that aren't there. Others say the phone doesn't even work, but the calls always come. I swallowed, panic rising. How do you know? All this? He hesitated. Because it happened to me, too. A chill swept through the room. Who's calling me? I asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Then he leaned forward. You don't want to know. Trust me. Don't answer. The phone again. I left the office, my mind spinning. Later that night, the phone rang again. I almost didn't pick it up, but something compelled me. Hello. This time, the voice was clearer. It was cold, calculated. You should have listened to him. My heart raced. What do you want? The voice chuckled softly, a dry, sinister laugh that made my skin crawl. You've been chosen. You'll hear from me again. Soon. The line went dead. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother telling the landlord goodbye. I just needed to get out. As I walked out the door, I glanced at the phone one last time. The screen was black and the number was gone. But something was off. The hum from the phone wasn't gone. It was still there, echoing in my ears. As I stepped into the elevator, I noticed the landlord standing in the hallway, his eyes wide and fearful. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, the elevator doors closed. I never looked back. It's been weeks, and I haven't answered a phone since. But every time the wind picks up, I can hear that same hum in the distance. Soft, low, like a growl, and sometimes, just sometimes I can, hear a whisper in my ear. You should have listened. I had just moved into a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone keeps to themselves. The houses were neat, lawns trimmed, and the air smelled of fresh-cut grass. My new place was a modest 2-story, tucked in a cul-de-sac. Perfect, I thought. Peaceful. It was late when I first noticed him, the neighbor in the house next door. I hadn't seen anyone when I moved in, but that night, through the window, I saw a man standing by the front door. He wasn't looking at me, but at something in the distance. Tall, thin, with hair too dark for the streetlights to illuminate. He wore a long coat despite the warmth of the evening. I figured he was just a late-night type of guy, so I went about my unpacking. But the next night, the same thing. I glanced out the window as I settled in for bed, and there he was again, standing perfectly still by the door, staring into the night. Curiosity started gnawing at me. Was he waiting for someone? A stranger, perhaps? But he never moved, just stood there like a statue, the chill of night creeping around him. Over the next few days, I started to notice more oddities. Every time I passed by his house, his blinds were drawn. I never saw him leave, or anyone else for that matter. The house was always silent, yet there were signs of life. The mailbox was emptied every day. The porch lights flickered on and off, like someone was coming and going, but the man was always standing in the same place at the same time. I couldn't take it anymore. One evening, after seeing him again standing motionless, I decided to finally introduce myself. I walked up to his front door and rang the bell. The door creaked open slowly, and he appeared, his face as pale as the moon. His eyes were dark, empty, like they hadn't seen daylight in years. "Can I help you?" His voice was soft, almost unnerving. I introduced myself, trying to ignore the unsettling aura he exuded. "I'm your neighbor. I've noticed you standing outside a lot. Is everything okay?" He blinked, his expression unreadable. "Everything is fine," he said simply. He paused. I like the quiet. I tried to smile. "Well, it's certainly peaceful. Here." He didn't reply. Instead, he stared at me for a long moment. "I'll see you around." I nodded and walked away quickly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. The quiet was deafening. Too perfect. Then I heard something. a faint tapping on my window. I froze. The tapping came again, rhythmic, deliberate. I stood and peered through the blinds. There, standing. In the yard was the man, his head tilted upward, his face nearly pressed against the glass, watching me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. He hadn't been there a moment ago, and now he was just there, in my yard. I locked the window and tried to shake off the fear, but sleep wouldn't come. The tapping continued, each tap louder until it felt like it was inside my head. I finally forced myself to close my eyes. When I woke up, it was daylight. The tapping had stopped. The man was gone, and everything seemed normal. Too normal. I breathed a sigh of relief and decided I was just overthinking things. That was until I heard the sound again, this time coming from inside the house. Soft footsteps. They echoed down the hallway, moving closer to my bedroom. I froze, paralyzed by fear. Then I heard the voice. "Don't worry, I'm just watching." The man's voice. I turned to see him standing in my doorway, his dark eyes piercing through me. You're not supposed to be here," I whispered. He smiled, a cold, terrifying smile. I like the quiet too. Suddenly, I understood. He hadn't been watching the outside world. He had been watching me, waiting for me to be alone, waiting for the moment when the silence would break. I jumped out of bed and ran down the stairs, but the house had changed. The front door was locked, the windows sealed shut. Every exit was blocked. Every route leading back to him. He was everywhere, behind me, in front of me, his presence suffocating. "You're just like the others," he whispered, his voice echoing in the stillness. "I wait for them to see me, but they never do. Until they do." And then there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just darkness. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, I was lying in the middle of my living room. The house was perfectly still. I stumbled to my feet, frantic, looking around, but the man was gone. Or was he? The door to my neighbor's house stood open, a faint red glow spilling out. The window was cracked, and I swore I saw his figure in the shadow, watching me. He had never left. He never would. The silence in the house was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I had always loved staying at old, remote hotels. They were full of character and mystery, and I had this strange habit of imagining the stories they held within their walls. So, when I found a secluded, run-down inn, hidden away in a mountain town, I couldn't resist. It was a small place, nestled in a valley, surrounded by towering trees. The kind of inn where you don't expect anyone to come through the door for days. The owner, an older woman named Agnes, was pleasant but quiet. She gave me a key to a room at the end of a long, creaky hallway. The room was exactly what I had hoped for. Faded wallpaper, a heavy wooden bed, and an antique mirror on the wall. It felt as if time had stopped. I loved it. That evening, after unpacking, I decided to explore the inn. The hallway was dim, with only a few light bulbs flickering overhead. As I walked toward the stairs, I noticed a door at the end of the hall. It was different from the others, weathered, scratched, like it had been locked for years. Curious, I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, and there was no key in sight. A chill ran through me. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or superstitions, but something about that door unsettled me. I quickly walked back to my room. Later that night, after dinner, I went to bed early. The room was cold, and the sound of wind howling outside made me feel even more isolated. I settled under the heavy covers and shut my eyes. The clock ticked away, and then I heard it, a faint sound at the door, a soft scraping. I dismissed it at first, assuming it was just the house settling. But then it came again, clearer this time. A slow, deliberate scratching, like nails dragging across the wood. I sat up in bed, heart racing. The air in the room felt heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The scratching continued. It was coming from the door, but I hadn't heard anyone pass by. It was too late for anyone to be outside. My breath quickened. I stood up, moved toward the door, and placed my ear against it. The sound stopped. I backed away, my mind racing. I was alone, at least I thought I was. I hadn't seen anyone else in the hall since I'd arrived. I glanced nervously around. The room. The only thing that seemed out of place was the antique mirror. It had always given me an odd feeling, but now it was impossible to ignore. My pulse quickened as I noticed something strange in the reflection. There was a shadow behind me, moving. I spun around, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and the shadow was gone. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just my imagination, but the night only grew more unsettling. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt as if something was near, watching me. At around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and went into the hall, hoping to find Agnes or someone else awake. The hallway was still, deathly quiet. But as I passed the door at the end of the hall, the one I had tried earlier, the scratching returned, louder this time, unmistakable. I turned the handle again, and this time, it opened. Inside was a small room, barely bigger than a closet, filled with old furniture and a musty smell. But it wasn't the room that made my heart stop. It was what was hanging on the wall, a framed photograph of a woman. The woman looked familiar, but it wasn't until I looked closer that I realized it was me. My blood ran cold. The woman in the picture had my face, but her eyes were dark, hollow, and behind her, just barely visible in the corner, was a figure standing in the shadows. I stumbled back, horror sinking in. Someone had been in my room. Someone had been watching me. I bolted down the hall, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the stairs and saw Agnes standing at the bottom, her face pale. She was staring up at me with wide, fearful eyes. "You need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Why?" I gasped. "Because," she whispered, "you were never meant to stay here. The man, he watches everyone who stays, and when they leave, they never leave alone." Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut. The air turned freezing cold. I turned to see the figure from the photograph standing at the top of the stairs. And then the scratching started again. The figure didn't move, but the nails. They were coming for me. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a weekend getaway with some friends. We rented a cabin in the middle of nowhere, far from the hustle and bustle of city life. There was a certain charm in the isolation. I was eager to disconnect and unwind. But that charm quickly faded when we made our first stop for gas. The gas station was the only building for miles. A dusty, dimly lit place with a single pump outside. The neon sign flickered above us, struggling to stay lit. The air felt thick, like the heat hadn't moved in hours. Inside, the store was cramped and musty. An old man behind the counter gave us a long stare as we walked in. "You folks headed to the cabin up the way?" he asked, his voice rough as if he hadn't spoken in days. "Yeah, just on our way," I replied, feeling uneasy. There was something about the way he looked at us, like he already knew where we were going. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled something from beneath the counter, a small, weathered map. He slid it across to me. "The road. Ahead's not safe after dark. Take the long route?" His voice dropped to a near whisper. "The shortcuts. Not right." My friends laughed it off, assuming it was just some local superstition. But I couldn't shake the feeling in my stomach. We paid and left, continuing down the road toward our cabin. The deeper we drove into the woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees pressed in on us like walls, blocking out the fading sunlight. The further we went, the more the air felt heavy, damp with something wrong. By the time we reached the cabin, it was nearly pitch black. The place was beautiful, tucked away at the edge of a small lake, but there was an eerie stillness to it, like the world outside didn't exist. We unpacked quickly and lit a fire in the fireplace, but as the hours passed, a strange feeling settled over me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the house felt like it was watching us. Around midnight, we heard something from the woods, a low rustling, like something large moving through the brush. It was too loud to be an animal. My friend Rachel joked that it was probably just a bear, but her voice wavered, betraying her nerves. We all laughed nervously, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. Then, a loud bang against the cabin door made us all freeze. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer, but the door shook again. Rachel was the first to act. She grabbed a flashlight and we all followed, her to the door, hearts pounding. Slowly, she opened it. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the blackness of the woods. "Nothing," Rachel said, her voice a little too loud in the silence. She stepped outside. "Rachel, don't." I tried to stop her, but it was too late. She screamed. We rushed out after her, but by the time we reached the edge of the porch, she was gone. The woods swallowed her whole, and all we heard was the eerie wind rustling through the trees. Panic set in. We called her name, but no response came. Then I noticed something strange in the distance, a flickering light moving slowly through the trees. It was a lantern. It was swinging, but there was no one holding it. Something made me step forward. I don't know why. Maybe I hoped it was Rachel trying to find her way back. But as I walked closer to the light, my friends shouted for me to stop. The lantern swung wildly, moving faster now, and I could hear it. The soft, steady thudding of something large, something heavy, moving in the dark. My heart raced, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the light. Then I saw them, figures in the trees, moving with unnatural speed. They were tall, too tall, with long arms that reached out toward me, their faces obscured by shadows. But their eyes, pale, wide, glowing, were locked on me, and I felt my blood freeze. I turned and ran back to the cabin, but as I reached the door, it slammed shut in my face. My friends were inside, shouting for me to get in, but when I looked back at the woods, the lantern was gone. The figures were too. But that wasn't the worst part. It was Rachel's voice. It was coming from the woods. "Help me," she whispered, barely audible but unmistakable. "Please, come back." I tried to speak, tried to scream, but the words caught in my throat. My friends were already unlocking the door, but when I stepped inside, something was different. The air was colder, heavier. The cabin felt wrong. And then I saw it. On the wall, next to the fireplace, carved into the wood with deep gouges, was a message. "They wait for the last one." The lights flickered and went out. All that was left was the lantern light, now casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I looked toward the window and saw it. Rachel, standing in the woods, staring at me, her eyes empty and hollow, the lantern swinging from her hand. The door slammed shut again. We were trapped, and it was waiting for us all. It was a cold winter evening when I moved into the old apartment. The place was cheap, way cheaper than any of the others I'd seen, but I didn't care. I needed a place to stay, and I was desperate. The landlord, a wiry old man with a raspy voice, handed me the keys with a grim smile and a warning. "Don't stay up too late," he said, his eyes narrowing. "This building has a history." I didn't think much of it at first. After all, old buildings always had strange stories attached. The apartment was tiny, but it had a certain charm. cracked wooden floors, creaky doors, and a big bay window that let in the dim light of the street. It was perfect. That night, I went to bed early, exhausted from the move. The silence was thick in the air, and the creaks of the old structure seemed amplified in the quiet. I lay in bed, the comfort of a new place keeping me relaxed, when I heard it, a faint scratching. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the wood shifting with the cold. But then the scratching came again, followed by a soft thump. It was coming from inside the walls. I froze, my heart pounding. It sounded like something was moving, something trying to get out. I turned on the lights, my mind racing. Was it a rat? Some sort of animal? The scratching stopped. I waited, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of it. The apartment was old, sure, but not that old. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and tried to go back to sleep. But sleep didn't come. The next night, the scratching returned. This time, it was louder, more persistent. The thumping was heavier. My skin crawled. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and started looking around. I checked the walls, the floorboards, even the small closet. But nothing. The noise seemed to come from the area around the bed, directly beneath the floor. I decided to go down to the building's maintenance room the next day and ask the landlord about it. Maybe there was some kind of vermin infestation. He wasn't in, so I left a note and went about my day, but the scratching continued that night, worse than before. The thumps now felt like they were right under my bed. The next morning, I woke up with a start. The light from the street lamp filtered through my window. The scratching had stopped, but something felt off. I looked down at the floor, and that's when I saw it. A thin crack in the floorboard, no bigger than a hairline fracture. But something glimmered underneath it. Slowly, I knelt down and pried it open. There, in the space beneath the floor, was a small metal box. I pulled it out, my hands shaking. The box was old, rusted with age, and covered in strange symbols. I opened it, expecting to find dust or forgotten trinkets, but inside was something else entirely. A small, mummified hand. It was human. The instant my fingers touched it, the scratching noise erupted again, louder this time, like claws scraping against the walls. It felt like the room was shaking. I dropped the hand back into the box and slammed it shut, but the scratching didn't stop. Ran out of the apartment, heart racing, and went straight to the landlord. When I told him what had happened, his expression darkened. He didn't seem surprised. "You shouldn't have opened it," he said softly, his eyes not meeting mine. "That building has a past. There's something in the walls. It wasn't always just rats." "What do you mean? What was in the box?" I demanded. The landlord sighed, his voice lowering to a whisper. "Years ago, a tenant went missing. No one knows what happened to him, but the scratching started shortly after. They say he's still here, trapped inside the walls. Every few months, someone new moves in, and the scratching starts again. It never stops until the next person finds it." A chill ran down my spine. I was the next person. I went back to the apartment, and for the first time, I noticed how the walls seemed to pulse, as though something was moving beneath the plaster. The floor beneath me groaned as though something large was shifting. The air grew thick, suffocating. That night, the scratching came back, louder than ever. I tried to ignore it, but I could feel something watching me, its eyes burning through the walls. The sound was maddening, a constant, insistent scrape that grew closer, as if whatever was inside the walls was trying to break free. I pulled the blanket over my head and squeezed my eyes shut, hoping for sleep. But the moment I drifted off, I felt it, a cold breath against my neck. I shot up in bed, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The scratching had stopped. Everything was silent. But as I reached for the light switch, my gaze fell on the wall, opposite me. The plaster had cracked further, revealing a small slit in the surface, and from that slit, a hand, pale and skeletal, was slowly creeping through. I ran out of the apartment and never looked back. I had been searching for a new place to rent for weeks, my old apartment too small, too noisy, and too far from work. When I found the listing, it seemed perfect. An old house on the outskirts of the city, secluded yet close enough to everything. The price was shockingly low, but the landlord assured me that it was simply because it had been on the market for a while. The first day I moved in, the house felt wrong. Not in a way I could explain, but in a way I could feel deep in my bones. The rooms were large and the walls were lined with old, yellowed wallpaper. The air smelled stale and the floors creaked with every step. Still, I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the house's age. The landlord had given me a tour when I signed the lease, and there was one room that stood out, a small, windowless door at the end of a long hallway. He warned me not to go in there. "That room has been locked for years," he said, his voice unusually firm. "Nobody's ever stayed in it. I keep the key for safety. You don't want to open it." He smiled as though it were a joke, but something about his eyes, wide and nervous, made me uncomfortable. That night, as I settled into my new bedroom, I couldn't stop thinking about that door. The house was dark except for the weak light from the street lamp outside, casting eerie shadows against the walls. My curiosity gnawed at me, making sleep difficult. I kept hearing strange sounds, scratching noises in the walls, faint whispers, or maybe it was just the house settling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was waiting on the other side of that door. The next day, after work, I couldn't resist anymore. I had to see what was behind that door. I found the key under the old rug near the front door. It was small, rusted, and looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The door was cold to the touch as I turned the key, and I felt the oddest shiver run through me as it creaked open. The room inside was unlike anything I'd imagined. It was tiny, smaller than a closet, but the air was thick with an oppressive heaviness. The walls were covered in strange symbols that looked as if they had been scratched into the wood. There was no furniture, just a bare floor covered in dust. But what truly caught my eye was the mirror hanging on the wall, its surface cracked and stained. I stepped inside, my heartbeat quickening. As I examined the mirror, my reflection seemed off, distorted, blurry, and then it shifted. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing behind me in the reflection. A figure, tall, thin, but when I whipped around, there was no one there. I blinked, and the figure was gone, but the chill remained. That's when I noticed the door had closed behind me. I reached for the handle to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I tried again, panic rising, but the door refused to open. The air in the room grew colder, and the whispering began, soft at first, like someone was breathing in my ear. I spun around, heart racing, and saw the reflection in the mirror shift again. The figure was closer now, standing behind me, but it wasn't my reflection anymore. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. I backed away, my breathing quick and shallow, but the door still wouldn't open. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl. I pounded on the door, my fists desperate against the wood. I felt trapped, like something in that room had me caught in its grasp. Suddenly, the door swung open and I stumbled out into the hallway. I gasped for air, my hands shaking. The door slammed shut behind me, but the whispers didn't stop. They followed me, echoing through the house, whispering my name, calling me back. That night, I tried to sleep, but the whispers continued, growing louder until they were right beside me. I knew the figure in the mirror hadn't gone away. It was still there, watching, waiting. I tried to leave the house the next morning, but when I reached the front door, it wouldn't open. The lock was jammed. I ran to the back door, but it, too, was sealed shut. The house wouldn't let me leave. Then I realized the whispers weren't just in the air. They were in the walls, and they were getting closer. I turned back to the room, but this time, the door wasn't locked. It was wide open as though waiting for me, and as I stepped inside, I saw the reflection in the mirror again. This time, the figure wasn't behind me. It was inside the mirror, staring at me with its hollow eyes, its smile widening. And then I understood. It wasn't the house that trapped me. It was the mirror, the room. And once you're in it, you can never leave. The door slammed shut behind me, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I screamed, but no one would hear me. I work the night shift at an underground parking garage. It's not glamorous, but it's quiet, and the pay is decent. The garage is massive, spanning 5 levels below ground. The air smells like oil and concrete, and the fluorescent lights buzz faintly, casting an unsettling pale glow. One night around 2 a.m., I was making my usual rounds. Most nights are uneventful. Empty cars, echoes of my footsteps, and the occasional shadow cast by a passing vehicle on the street above. But that night was different. As I descended to the 4th level, I noticed a car parked in a corner, far from any other vehicles. This wasn't unusual. Some people prefer privacy. But what caught my attention was the driver's seat. Someone was sitting there, their face obscured by shadows. I called out, asking if everything was okay. No response. Just the faint hum of the lights. I stepped closer, but when I was about 20 feet away, the figure turned its head toward me. It was too dark to make out any features, but I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Their head tilted slightly, like they were studying me. I decided not to press further. Maybe they were just waiting for someone. I finished my rounds quickly, but when I passed by the car again on my way back, it was empty. The hours dragged on. At 3:45, I was in the control room, watching the security monitors. I caught movement on the screen for the 4th level. The same corner where the car had been. A figure walked across the frame, slow and deliberate. The camera angle didn't give a clear view, but it was definitely the same person. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back down. When I reached the 4th level, the air felt colder than usual, and the faint smell of gasoline lingered. I shone my light around but saw no one, just rows of empty cars. As I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint metallic scraping sound. It echoed through the space, seeming to come from everywhere at once. My heart pounded as I swept the beam of my flashlight across the garage. Then I saw it, a handprint. It was smeared across the window of a car directly in front of me. The print wasn't normal. It was too large, and the fingers seemed wrong, elongated, as if they had been stretched unnaturally. I backed away, my flashlight shaking. Then the sound came again, closer this time. The scraping, like nails dragging across metal. I spun around, the beam catching movement just at the edge of the light. A figure emerged from between 2 cars. Its body was contorted, bent at impossible angles, as if its limbs had been broken and reassembled. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, stepping into the light with a grotesque smile stretched across its pale, featureless face. My legs froze. The thing cocked its head, mirroring the same curious tilt from earlier. It took a step toward me, its bare feet slapping against the concrete. I don't know how I found the strength, but I turned and ran. The elevator was too far, so I sprinted for the stairs. Behind me, the sound of slapping footsteps echoed. Faster, now, growing louder. I burst into the stairwell, slamming the door behind me. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then I heard it, the metallic scraping sound, but this time from above me. I looked up, and my flashlight caught the figure crawling down the wall, its body bending unnaturally, its fingers digging into the metal railings for support. I ran, stumbling over the steps, my breath ragged. When I finally reached the surface level, I threw open the exit door and collapsed onto the sidewalk. The cold night air felt like salvation. I quit the job the next day, but every now and then, When I park my car in a quiet garage or step into an empty stairwell, I hear it again, the faint sound of scraping metal, reminding me that some things don't stay underground. We always thought the old factory was abandoned. It stood at the edge of town, looming in the distance like a silent monument to forgotten industry. Once a hub of activity, it had fallen into disrepair years ago. The windows shattered and its metal framework rusted. The locals avoided it, rumors swirling about strange occurrences inside, but no one had dared venture close in years. One evening, my friends and I, 3 of us, decided to explore. We were bored, restless, and curious. The old factory loomed, far above the landscape, casting long shadows beneath its towering walls. It was eerie, the kind of place that seemed trapped in a forgotten past. We told ourselves it was just old, dilapidated, nothing more. As we approached, the silence was deafening. The air felt heavy, thick with something we couldn't quite identify. The closer we got, the colder the breeze seemed to grow, slipping through our jackets, turning our breath to mist. The factory itself was a maze of rusting metal and broken glass, debris scattered across the floor like forgotten relics of a time long gone. We made our way inside, stepping carefully over the rubble. The floor creaked underfoot, the echoes of our footsteps bouncing back at us, amplified by the emptiness. There was a lingering smell of decay and something else, something metallic, like old blood. We didn't pay it much attention at first, but then we began to notice strange sounds, faint, distant murmurs that seemed to come from deeper within. We stopped, our eyes scanning the dimness, our hearts thudding louder with each passing second. The factory was supposed to be abandoned after all. Emma whispered, "Did you hear that?" We nodded, uneasy, but brushed it off. We continued deeper, driven by a mix of curiosity and the hope of finding something hidden, something we couldn't explain. The deeper we went, the louder the murmuring became. It wasn't just voices anymore. It was laughter. Quiet at first, but growing, echoing off the steel walls, thin, hollow laughter that sent shivers down our spines. We could feel something watching us now. Ryan suddenly stopped, his face pale, as he pointed toward a corridor to the right. "Did you hear that?" His voice trembled. We strained to listen, the laughter now unmistakable, reverberating through the factory like a warning. "I'm not staying here," Emma said, her voice rising in panic. But as we turned to leave, the hallway behind us stretched unnaturally. The laughter seemed to ripple through the very air, reverberating louder, closer. Then we saw it. A figure. Faint, barely visible, drifting slowly toward us from the shadows. It wasn't human. Its face was obscured, but we could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and hollow. Its laughter echoed in the void as it drew nearer. We ran. There was no thought, just primal terror. We didn't look back, sprinting through the factory, our feet slipping on the broken floor, the laughter echoing behind us like a chorus of ghosts. The walls seemed to stretch, closing in, and we couldn't tell if we were running forward or circling endlessly. Somehow, we made it outside. The laughter faded, replaced by the oppressive silence of the night. We didn't speak. None of us dared. Look back at the factory. To this day, we haven't gone near that place again. The old factory stands as it did, silent and forgotten, but we know now. It's anything but abandoned. And we still hear the laughter sometimes in the quiet hours. Always. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything beyond what my eyes could see. Not until that night. It was just a normal evening when my friends and I decided to go hiking. We had heard about a hidden trail deep in the nearby forest, far from any roads, or signs of civilization. The air was crisp, the trees towered above us, their shadows stretching long and eerie as we followed the winding path. It was supposed to be a quiet escape, a peaceful night beneath the stars. The trail was narrow, barely, more than a dirt path with thick forest on either side. The sunlight dimmed fast, leaving only the soft glow from our flashlights to guide us. We didn't talk much, just walking, listening to the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle in the bushes. It was when we reached a clearing that things started to feel wrong. The atmosphere shifted. The forest was no longer the familiar, welcoming place it once was. The trees seemed taller, their branches forming a canopy that seemed to trap the light, casting deep shadows. The air grew colder, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We decided to set up camp there, thinking it was a good place to rest. But the longer we stayed, the more uneasy I became. The silence was deafening, as though the forest was holding its breath. I glanced around, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, but the woods felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. That's when I heard it. A faint, distant whisper. A voice, barely audible, carried on the wind. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. "Did you hear that?" I asked my friends, but they shook their heads, too preoccupied with setting up the tents. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as night fell, the whispers grew louder, weaving through the trees like they were calling to me. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, the darkness growing thicker. Then, in the stillness, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A shadow, taller than any tree, motionless. I couldn't make out its features, just a black silhouette, watching us. My heart pounded, and I called out to my friends, but they didn't see it. I took a step toward the figure, compelled despite the fear gripping me. As I drew closer, I noticed something strange. The figure didn't cast a shadow. The very ground beneath it seemed to bend around the shape, as though the light avoided it. It wasn't human. It was more like a void, a gap in reality. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't look away. I was frozen, watching as the figure tilted, its head almost as if acknowledging my presence. Then the whispers became a voice, calm but cold. "You shouldn't be here." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The figure took a slow step forward, and I took a step back, realizing there was no escape. The whispers turned to screams in my head, but still, I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The forest returned to its usual silence, but something had shifted. The unease lingered, heavier now, almost suffocating. My friends, oblivious to what had just happened, continued setting up camp, blissfully unaware. I never told them about the figure, about the whispers that still echo in my mind, and I never went back to those woods. To this day, I wonder if whatever I saw is still waiting. I'll never forget the day I visited that old bookstore. It was tucked away on a quiet street, surrounded by tall, crumbling brick buildings that leaned toward one another as though the city had forgotten about them. The windows of the bookstore were dusty and covered in fog, but something about it drew me in. It wasn't the kind of place people normally wandered into, but I found myself stepping through the creaking wooden door without hesitation. The bell above rang faintly, and the smell of old paper and dust hit me all at once. The place felt as though it had been untouched for decades. Bookshelves stretched high above my head, the spines old and faded. The light from the single bulb overhead flickered weakly. I wandered through the narrow aisles, trailing my fingers along the spines of the forgotten books, half expecting to hear the whispers of some long-lost ghostly stories. I picked up a few, old paperbacks, flipping through pages that crinkled in my hands. Something about the silence and the musty air felt almost otherworldly. I lost track of time, losing myself in the thick atmosphere of the store. At the end of one aisle, I found a shelf that seemed different from the rest. The books here were thinner, almost like pamphlets, their covers dark and worn. I pulled one from the shelf. Its title was barely legible, Whispers of the Forgotten. It wasn't the title that caught my attention, though. It was the strange sense of familiarity I felt as I opened it. The first few pages were scattered with strange symbols and text I couldn't read. I traced my fingers over them, my mind drawn to the obscure illustrations, twisted, distorted shapes that looked like they were from another world. I turned to the next page, and that's when I saw it. Words written in a language that wasn't English. They weren't letters, just strange symbols that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't stop reading, as though something was compelling me to continue. My hands trembled as I read the first few lines. "Those who seek will find, but they may not return." The words sent a cold wave through my body. I glanced around the bookstore, suddenly realizing how quiet it had become. The faint creak of the floorboards seemed to echo louder than it should have, and I could feel eyes on me. It was as though the store itself was watching, waiting. The room seemed darker now, shadows stretching toward me from the corners of the shelves. My heart raced as I looked back at the book. The pages turned by themselves, landing on a chapter that spoke of places that no longer existed. Forgotten towns, cities swallowed by time and silence. The more I read, the more I felt an odd connection to these places. It was as if I had been there before, even though I knew I hadn't. Suddenly, the light overhead flickered violently, casting everything into near darkness. A chill swept through the room, and I heard a whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. "Turn back." I froze, the whisper echoing in my ears. My eyes darted around the bookstore, but there was no one there. My breath came in shallow gasps, as I realized I was alone. The pages of the book flipped again, this time stopping on a section titled "The Forgotten Path." My hands were shaking as I read, "The path is long and lonely, but those who seek will find. Beware, for what is lost may never be reclaimed." The room felt colder now, and I could hear the sound of footsteps, though no one was there. The air was thick, and it felt as though something was closing in on me. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, my mind consumed by the words of the book. It was then that I noticed something at the edge of my vision. A figure, tall, shadowy, and indistinct, stood at the end of the aisle, watching me. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Return. What is lost?" Panic set in, and I knew I had to get out. I stumbled backward, clutching the book tightly. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze following me as I hurried toward the door. As I ran out of the bookstore, the bell above rang once more, echoing into the night. I didn't look back. The streets outside were empty, silent, as though the city had swallowed the bookstore whole. I don't know what I brought with me from that place, but every night since I've dreamed of the figures and the whispers. There's a piece of that book still in my hands, and I wonder, will I ever be able to forget, or will I be drawn back seeking something I might not want to find? A friend suggested we drive out to the old factory, located deep in the woods. The place had been abandoned for decades, they said, left to rot after the industry moved elsewhere. No one had been there in years, and the idea of exploring an eerie, forgotten space seemed too intriguing to resist. We set off early in the afternoon, 3 of us packed into an old sedan. The drive was long, winding through narrow, overgrown roads until we finally reached the outskirts of the factory. From the outside, it looked like a relic of another time. Tall, weathered brick walls covered in ivy, windows shattered and empty. The once mighty structure loomed over us, silent and still. We parked the car, and as we approached, a shiver ran down my spine. The place felt abandoned, sure, but not empty. There was a palpable sense of something watching, something that had never truly left. Inside, the factory was a maze of metal and decay. Broken machinery stood rusted and still, large gears covered in dust. The air smelled stale, and the silence was oppressive. We wandered through the empty halls, shining our flashlights on walls covered in graffiti, peeling paint, and remnants of what once was. At first, there wasn't much to see, just shadows stretching across the floor, the occasional creak of the old wooden beams above. But as we moved deeper into the building, things began to feel wrong. It wasn't the faint echoes of our footsteps on the concrete floor, or the way the dust seemed to hang in the air like a living thing. It was the feeling that we weren't alone. I don't know how to describe it, but it wasn't fear in the usual sense. More like an overwhelming sense of presence, something watching, following us. We kept moving, dismissing the feeling as overactive imaginations, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. We reached what had once been the main hall, a vast expanse of cracked tiles and broken machinery. At the far end, partially hidden by a stack of debris, was a staircase leading to what looked like the second floor. We made our way towards it, stepping carefully through the clutter of fallen pipes and rusted metal. That's when we heard it. A low, faint groan, like metal twisting under pressure. We froze. It wasn't coming from the floor above, it was below. My stomach sank as I realized it was coming from the basement. The noise was distant, almost mechanical, but it felt wrong. I was about to suggest we leave when one of my friends, Jason, walked toward the staircase. His flashlight beam flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls as he climbed. The sound continued, growing louder now, as if whatever made it was approaching. "Come on," Jason called back, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Let's see what's down there." I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. The others followed Jason down the creaking staircase, leaving me behind, my nerves frayed. I clutched my flashlight tighter, scanning the space. The noise had grown deafening now. Something was down there, something heavy. When I reached the bottom, the scene before me made my breath catch. The basement was larger than I'd expected, filled with old machinery and storage crates. But what stood out were the deep, claw-like scratches etched into the floor, running from one end to the other. It was like something had dragged itself across the concrete, leaving long, deep marks behind. I tried to tell myself it was just decay, but the noises had stopped. The silence was now deafening. We all stood there, staring at the marks, when one of my friends let out a gasp. I followed his gaze, and there, in the far corner of the basement, was something I'll never forget. A figure, a tall, pale figure with hollow eyes, barely discernible in the dim light. It was partially obscured by shadows, its features indistinct, but I could feel its gaze, cold and empty, locked onto us. "No," I whispered, taking a step back. "Let's go." But Jason was already moving toward it. His flashlight illuminated the figure, and for a moment we all stood frozen, unable to look away. Suddenly, the figure spoke, not with words, but with a low, inhuman hum that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. It wasn't a voice so much as a presence, pressing down on us, suffocating us. "We need to leave," one of my friends finally said, his voice trembling. We didn't wait for a second invitation. We fled up the staircase, the sound of the figure's hum fading behind us. My legs felt like jelly as we burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. As we drove away, I glanced back in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the darkness of the forest. But there, standing at the edge of the factory, was the figure. It didn't move, just stood there, watching us as we drove away. We never spoke about it again. But I know what I saw that night wasn't something from this world. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, waiting. I was driving home late after finishing a long day at the plant. The road was empty, winding through hills and fields that stretched on for miles. It was one of those stretches where there's nothing but darkness, just you and the headlights cutting through the night. I preferred it that way. No distractions, no noise, just the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. It had been a rough shift, The plant was always loud, always hot, but tonight felt different. A strange feeling had been hanging over me all day, a low, persistent unease that I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about the strange, flickering shadows that danced on the walls of the machinery room and the echoing creaks I heard whenever I moved too far away from the others. I tried not to let it get to me, but something wasn't right. The radio crackled again and I turned it down, the silence of the night settling in once more. As I drove, I noticed how still everything was. Even the usual hum of insects seemed to have disappeared. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something is waiting just beyond the edge of your vision. I passed through a stretch of trees, their branches hanging low, creating dark tunnels over the road. I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The mirror reflected only my car and the empty road behind me. As I came around a bend, the headlights caught something strange ahead. It wasn't a roadblock or an animal. It was a figure, standing motionless by the side of the road, wearing a long coat that blended into the night. My heart stopped for a moment. I didn't recognize the figure, and the fact that it was just standing there, perfectly still, made my stomach churn. I slowed down, my mind racing. Who would be out here at this hour? The figure didn't move, didn't flinch as my headlights illuminated it. I couldn't see any facial features, just a vague, shadowy form beneath the coat. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I couldn't bring myself to stop, but I slowed down, creeping past the figure. It never moved, never flinched as I passed by. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and my pulse throbbed in my ears. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but the figure remained still. A mile down the road, I dared to look back again. The figure was gone. I didn't stop driving until I hit the city limits. The whole ride home, I kept replaying what I'd seen. It didn't make sense. Who, or what, stood there, unmoving, in the middle of nowhere? When I finally got home, I locked the door and turned on every light in the house, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something had been watching me, waiting for me to pass. I never went back to that road again. I don't think I ever will. I never expected a simple road trip with friends to turn into something so terrifying. It was meant to be a weekend getaway, a drive to an old abandoned lighthouse by the coast, miles from civilization. We thought it'd be fun, something adventurous, but that trip is burned into my memory forever. We left in the early afternoon, 4 of us packed into a beat-up car, the windows rolled down as we blasted music and laughed. The drive was long and uneventful, winding through the countryside with only the occasional stretch of trees and empty fields. By the time we arrived at the old lighthouse, the sun was already setting, casting everything in a soft, eerie glow. The lighthouse stood tall and weathered, its windows dark and shattered. It had been abandoned for decades, locals avoiding it after countless stories of strange sightings and disappearances. But we were young and naive, more interested in the thrill of exploring something unknown. We made our way up the worn, steep staircase that led to the top of the lighthouse. The wind howled through the cracked windows, and the sounds of the ocean crashing against the cliffs below echoed around us. The view from the top was breathtaking, until I noticed something in the distance. At first, I wasn't sure what I was seeing. A figure, distant, barely visible against the darkening sky. It stood there, unmoving, watching us. My stomach sank. I nudged my friend, whispering, but before I could say anything, the figure turned and vanished behind the cliffs. We tried to brush it off, convincing ourselves it was just our imagination, or maybe someone else exploring the area. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The wind picked up again, louder now, like something was urging us to leave. We returned to the car and headed back, the drive back feeling longer and more oppressive than the one there. The fields and trees seemed to loom, shadows stretching unnaturally across the road. It wasn't until we were a few miles down the winding path that things started to get strange. The radio crackled to life, static filling the air. We all froze. There was no signal out here, no reason for it to be on. I reached out to turn it off, but the sound didn't stop. The static continued, shifting into something more than noise, a voice. At first, I couldn't make out what it was saying. It was muffled, distorted, like something trapped in the wires. But then I heard it clearer. Turn back. The voice was cold, hollow, and deep. My friends were frozen, staring at me. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. It repeated again, louder this time. Turn back. You shouldn't be here. The car began to shake, as if the very road was trembling beneath us. I wanted to scream, to pull over, but the car wasn't responding. It just kept moving, as if something was forcing us forward. We reached a stretch of road where the trees thickened, blocking out the sky. The shadows became heavier, darker. I could barely make out the road anymore. Then I saw it. Those figures again standing by the side of the road just out of sight. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They were watching us. The voice returned, louder, more frantic now. Turn back! I slammed on the brakes, but it was no use. The car continued, the trees closing in around us. I could hear the whispers now, indistinct but growing louder. I felt a cold, oppressive pressure bearing down on me. Let us go, I whispered, my voice shaking. But no one answered. The figures grew closer, their shadows blending into the dark. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the car stopped. The engine sputtered and died, leaving us in silence. The static on the radio faded, and the world felt still, as if everything had paused, waiting. We didn't move. We couldn't. I stared out into the blackness, my friends motionless beside me. The figures were gone, but the whisper of the voice echoed in my head. Turn back. I had always loved the quiet of late-night drives, the stillness of the road, the moonlight illuminating the empty stretch ahead. It was the perfect time to think, to be alone with your thoughts. So, one evening, after a long day of work, I decided to take a drive through the countryside. The roads were winding and dark, but the drive itself was soothing. I didn't have a destination in mind, just wanted to escape the noise of the city and clear my head. The air felt crisp, and I rolled down the windows, letting the cool breeze rush in. As I drove further into the night, the world around me seemed to shrink. The only sounds were the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustling of trees that loomed on either side of the road. I didn't pass another car for miles. It was peaceful in a way that was almost surreal. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was a hitchhiker, but something about the way they stood, unmoving, just watching the road, felt off. They didn't seem to be waiting for a car. They were just there, staring. I slowed down, unsure of what to make of it. As I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a dark hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart pounded as I drove past, trying to keep my eyes on the road. I didn't dare look back, but I just knew. It was watching me. The rest of the drive was consumed by a growing sense of dread. The peaceful night had become something else entirely. Every creak of the car, every shadow cast by the moon, felt like they were part of something larger. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overtired and spooked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I reached a small town as dawn began to break. The figure was gone, but I couldn't forget the sense of being watched. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the car keys, trying to calm my racing thoughts. That's when I noticed something strange. My rearview mirror was cracked, as if something had grabbed it. I haven't driven that road since. I was 13 when it happened, during a summer trip to my grandparents' old farmhouse. It wasn't just any trip, it was supposed to be a simple visit, full of farmland sunsets and lazy afternoons. But from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The farmhouse itself was isolated, sitting at the edge of an overgrown field, far from any neighboring houses. My parents assured me it was just an old family home, quiet and peaceful. But from the moment I walked in, a strange sense of unease took hold. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The old wooden floorboards groaned under the weight of each step, and the creaking of the house seemed louder in the silence than it should have been. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a faint rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from inside the house, it was from outside. At first, I dismissed it as some small animal, maybe a bird or a raccoon, but the tapping grew louder and more deliberate as the hours passed. In the morning, I asked my grandmother about the noise. She shrugged, a little smile playing on her lips. Just the old trees. The wind does strange things out here. But the look in her eyes said she didn't believe it either. The days passed, but the tapping never stopped. It wasn't just random anymore. It was constant. I began to hear it even when I was awake, echoing through the empty halls of the farmhouse. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and no matter where I went, I felt like I was being followed by unseen eyes. One afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding fields. They stretched out for miles, untouched by modern life, just the way they had been for decades. The air was thick with the scent of hay and soil. The trees creaked gently as the wind picked up, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I wandered far from the farmhouse until I could no longer see the building. That's when I saw it. A figure. Not far from where I stood, barely visible beneath the branches of a gnarled oak tree. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, too tall, its form distorted as if it didn't belong in the world. I couldn't make out its face. Only dark, hollow eyes that seemed to sink into its head, lifeless and empty. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure remained still, unmoving, as though waiting for me. Slowly, I raised my hand, and with a trembling finger, I pointed. The figure didn't react. It didn't flinch or move. It just stood there, silent and endless. The tapping continued. Only now it wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It seemed to come from within me, a dull rhythm that echoed in my ears. I felt like I was being pulled toward the figure, drawn in by something I couldn't understand. I don't know how much time passed before I finally turned and ran. My legs moved faster than they ever had, back toward the farmhouse. The figure never followed. It simply watched, unmoving, as I fled. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the tapping. It was quieter now, but still there, persistent and unrelenting. I realized that whatever I had seen wasn't something I could run from. It had become a part of me. We left the farmhouse the next day, but the tapping never stopped. I can still hear it sometimes, especially in the quiet moments when I'm alone. It's there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. It was a warm summer evening when my friends and I decided to take a trip to a nearby lake. The lake was small, tucked away between rolling hills and dense forests. It wasn't particularly popular, more of a hidden gem that locals like to keep quiet. We had heard stories of how peaceful it was, a perfect spot to relax under the stars. I thought it would be a calm escape from the noise of everyday life, something we all needed. The drive there was quiet, the road winding through thick woods, the sun dipping low on the horizon. When we finally arrived, the lake stretched out before us, reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun. We set up a few blankets and chairs, unpacked a picnic, and watched as the last rays of light faded into the trees. For a while, everything felt idyllic. The air was cool, the breeze gentle. We ate, talked, and joked about the usual things. work, relationships, and what we'd be doing the rest of the summer. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional splash of water. As night began to fall, we could see the first stars starting to peek through the darkening sky. The only light was from our small battery-powered lantern. It cast long shadows across the shore. We decided to take a walk along the lakeside, following a narrow, worn trail that led into the woods. The path curved gently, the trees towering over us, their leaves whispering softly in the breeze. It was peaceful, serene. I told myself how lucky we were to have found this quiet escape, away from the chaos of the world. That's when things began to shift. We had been walking for maybe 20 minutes when we noticed something odd. The sounds of nature seemed off. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves. It was too quiet. Even the gentle lapping of the water against the shore had stopped. Maybe we went too far, one of my friends said, glancing nervously around at the darkening forest. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. It's probably just the woods settling. Happens sometimes. We kept walking, but my gut told me something wasn't right. The trees seemed closer now, more oppressive, their shadows stretching longer. The path itself had started to feel more narrow, as if the forest was closing in around us. Then came the first sound. Low, distant, but unmistakable. A faint, unsettling whimper. I stopped in my tracks, listening. My friends turned to me, their faces pale. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered. I nodded, though my throat had gone dry. The sound came again, clearer this time. A soft, mournful cry like someone was in pain. It echoed through the woods, bouncing off the trees and vanishing into the darkness. I'd never heard anything like it before. "We should go back," one of them said. Their voice was trembling, but before we could turn around, we heard it again. This time, much closer. It was like the cry was following us. My pulse quickened. I felt trapped, unable to shake the feeling that whatever was making that noise wasn't human. "Guys, we're too far in," someone said. "We need to get back. Now." But as we hurried to turn around, something caught my eye. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the trees. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its shape was twisted, distorted, and it seemed to blend with the shadows around it. I couldn't make out its face, just the faint glimmer of pale, empty eyes. I froze. My friends stopped too, noticing the same thing. None of us could speak, our breath catching in our throats as the figure took a step forward. It wasn't moving like a person. It was slow, deliberate, as though each step was agonizingly unnatural. The cry came again, louder, as if the figure were trying to communicate. Though what it wanted, I couldn't fathom. "Run," I whispered, and my voice cracked. Without hesitation, we turned and sprinted back toward the lake, the sound of our pounding footsteps echoing in the stillness. We didn't look back. When we finally reached the shore, we collapsed onto the blankets, gasping for air. The lake was still there, dark and calm under the moonlight, but the figure, whatever it was gone. None of us spoke for a long time. We packed up our things in silence, our minds racing. Whatever had been out there wasn't something we could explain, and part of me is still afraid it might still be watching. We haven't gone back to that lake. The night of the power outage was supposed to be like any other. I had decided to visit the nearby park for an evening walk, something I did regularly to clear my head. The park was large, surrounded by woods, and during the day it was a peaceful place, but at night it took on a different feel, isolated, mysterious. It was around 10 p.m. when I arrived. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my feet. The park was completely empty. Not a single light from any street lamp or building. The power had gone out in the entire area earlier that evening, casting everything in deep, unnatural darkness. I didn't mind the quiet at first. In fact, it felt kind of serene. I continued walking down the main trail, the stars above me barely illuminating the path. It was peaceful, but something about the absence of light made the woods feel heavier, more oppressive. The trees loomed closer, casting long, distorted shadows that shifted with the breeze. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A chill ran down my spine as I stopped and glanced around. The park was vast, stretching farther than I could see in the darkness. I told myself to stop being paranoid, but the silence was so complete it felt as though something was watching, waiting. I had no phone service, no way to call for help if anything went wrong. I picked up my pace, walking faster. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the woods seemed to close in more with each step. That's when I heard it, the sound of faint rustling behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing. Just trees, shadows stretching endlessly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. No response. I listened harder, straining my ears, but the only thing I could hear was the wind whispering through the branches. I continued walking, nerves frayed. The trail twisted and turned, and soon I found myself farther from where I had entered. The forest seemed to grow denser, darker. I couldn't see the path anymore, the trees too thick. I stopped, realizing I was lost. Panic set in. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but the trail behind me had vanished. It was as though the woods had swallowed it whole. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, as though something was lurking just beyond my vision, unseen but present. I tightened my jacket around me and forced myself to breathe, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Then I heard it again, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It sounded like my name. I froze. My stomach twisted and I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but something told me otherwise. My name echoed once more, softer this time, as though the air itself was speaking it. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaky. No response. My heart pounded louder now, a deafening rhythm in the stillness. The whisper came again, closer this time, so close I could feel it brushing against my ear. I stumbled backward, bumping into something solid, something that shouldn't have been there. I spun around and froze. In front of me stood a figure, draped in what looked like tattered, flowing fabric. Its face was hollow, devoid of features, and its eyes gleamed faintly with an otherworldly light. It was taller than any person, and its presence felt ancient, unnatural. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure took a slow step forward, and I realized it wasn't walking. It glided, as though floating just above the ground. The woods seemed to press in around me, closing tighter, until there was nothing but the sound of my ragged breathing. Then, from behind me, I heard a voice, low and hollow. "You're not supposed to be here." I spun around again, but there was no one there. The figure had vanished. I stood there trembling, my mind unable to comprehend what I had just seen. I turned and stumbled away from the spot, not looking back. The woods seemed endless, but somehow I found my way back to the edge of the park. By the time I made it home, the sun was beginning to rise. I never went back to that park again. I've always loved hiking and spending time in nature. It was one of those things that grounded me, being out in the woods, away from the noise of the world. A few weeks ago, my friends and I decided to explore a trail we hadn't been on before. It wasn't too far from town, but far enough that we figured we'd have it to ourselves. The day was perfect. Clear skies, the sun warming our backs as we hiked deeper into the woods. We made our way to a secluded clearing, nestled between towering trees. It was peaceful. Birds chirped, and the wind whispered through the leaves, carrying the scent of pine. We set up camp near a stream, took off our backpacks, and stretched out, content to take in the beauty of the forest. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trees, we gathered around the fire we'd built. The crackling sound of the flames was soothing, and we all felt at ease, joking and sharing stories. I didn't realize how dark it had become until one of my friends pointed up at the sky. "It's almost pitch black," she said, squinting upward. We all looked at each other, the laughter fading into a heavy silence. None of us had expected how fast the night would fall. The forest seemed to absorb the fading light, leaving us in complete darkness, save for the fire. Then, something shifted. I wasn't sure if it was the stillness of the forest or the creeping sensation in the pit of my stomach, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer alone. I didn't want to alarm my friends, so I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably just the wind rustling the leaves or my imagination playing tricks. But then I heard it. A faint, unnatural noise coming from deeper in the woods. It wasn't a creature or an animal. It was something wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the source of the noise. The beam cut through the trees, but there was nothing there, just more blackness. My friends noticed my unease and asked if I was okay. I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy, but my voice came out shaky as I answered. "There's something out there." One of my friends scoffed. "It's probably just a deer or something." I wanted to believe that, but it didn't feel like an animal. The noise grew louder, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was distant at first, then closer. Each tap echoed through the trees, growing louder and more persistent. "I think we should head back," I said, my voice trembling. "Back where?" one of my friends asked. "The trail's too far. We'd be walking in the dark." But something about the forest felt off, like the trees themselves were watching us. The tapping continued, closer now, like something was moving through the underbrush. Then, the silence shattered. A figure emerged from the trees, moving in a way that wasn't human. Its form was elongated, almost unnatural, and it moved without making a sound. I could barely process what I was seeing, my heart racing as I fumbled with my flashlight. The beam hit it, and that's when I saw its face. No eyes, no mouth, just a hollow black void where a face should have been. It stood there, unmoving, watching us. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The thing didn't approach us, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, watching. One of my friends whispered, "What is that?" "I have no idea," I managed to choke out. We sat frozen, staring at the figure until the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the direction of the figure. It was coming from behind us, from the clearing where we had our camp. We spun around, shining our flashlights. There was nothing there, just the fire, flickering dimly. But the tapping grew louder, now on both sides of us. Panic set in. We grabbed our things and ran, not looking back, not stopping, until we reached the trail. The figure never followed us, but the sounds didn't stop. They still echo in my mind. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I keep wondering, what was that thing? And why didn't it come after us? It started as an ordinary weekend trip with a few friends. We'd decided to go hiking on a trail deep in the mountains. None of us had been there before, but the online reviews promised breathtaking views and quiet solitude, far from the noise of city life. The plan was simple: hike during the day, camp overnight, and return refreshed. But something about that trail didn't feel right from the start. The first few miles were beautiful. The air was crisp, the forest thick with towering pines, and the only sounds were birdsong and the crunch of gravel beneath our boots. We stopped often, marveling at the view as we climbed higher. The trail was marked clearly, and there were no other hikers around, which wasn't unusual given how secluded the place was. By midday, we were deep into the forest, far from any sign of civilization. It wasn't until we reached the fork in the trail that things started to feel strange. The sign was old and faded, barely legible. One path led to the summit, the other to a clearing near a river. We debated for a bit, but decided to head toward the clearing. Something about the summit felt off. The clearing was beautiful. We set up camp there, unpacking our gear and gathering wood for a fire. The river ran nearby, its gentle sound soothing in the quiet. We were tired from the hike and settled into the camp, enjoying the peace and solitude. That night, around midnight, something woke me. It wasn't a sound. It was more like a shift in the atmosphere. The air had become heavier and the forest felt still, too still. I lay there, heart racing, listening. At first, there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps. They weren't human footsteps. They were lighter, quicker, and moving in circles around our camp. I sat up, freezing, trying to make sense of the noise. The others were asleep, unaware of what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the sound. Nothing. Just shadows moving beyond the reach of the beam. I stood, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was probably an animal. But as I scanned the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't driven by instinct. It was watching us. The footsteps grew closer, slower. They circled the camp like something was observing us from the trees. I could hear breathing, shallow and raspy, echoing through the stillness. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I backed away from the tent. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse, but enough to make my blood run cold. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the clearing. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but its eyes, they glowed faintly, like dull embers. It didn't move, didn't approach, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I stumbled backward, trying to wake my friends. My voice was hoarse as I called out, but they didn't stir. The figure remained, unmoving, as if frozen in place. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. My hands shook as I tried to think of what to do. That's when I noticed something strange. The trees. There were no shadows. Everything was bathed in a dim, unnatural light. The forest wasn't as dark as it should have been. The figure moved slightly, almost as if it had heard me, its silhouette more defined now. I didn't wait. Grabbing my pack, I ran for the river, heart pounding in my chest. The sound of my own footsteps echoed through the stillness, but I didn't dare look back. I followed the river, trying to escape whatever was behind me. Hours later, I stumbled into a small town, miles away from the trail. My clothes were torn, my legs scratched from running through the woods. I collapsed at the first building I saw, an old gas station, battered and out of breath. The clerk at the counter looked at me confused. "What happened?" he asked, his voice echoing in the empty space. I wanted to explain, to tell him about the figure, the footsteps, the silence. But no words would come. I never went back to the mountains, never hiked another trail. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. It was the middle of summer when a group of friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to a nearby lake. None of us had ever been there before, but the promise of clear waters and warm sun was too tempting to pass up. The drive wasn't long, just far enough to feel like we were escaping the noise of the city, but not so far that we'd lose cell service. The day started perfectly. We arrived early, claiming a spot near the shore, and spent the afternoon swimming, laughing, and basking in the sunlight. The lake was calm, almost unnaturally so. The water was glassy and there wasn't a single ripple. It was eerie in its stillness, but we were too preoccupied with the warmth and the relaxation to give it much thought. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the water, we decided to go for one last swim before the evening cooled. The water was still as we dove in, and it felt refreshing. The perfect end to a perfect day. But as I swam further out, the light from the setting sun began to fade, and the water became darker. That's when I noticed something strange beneath me. It wasn't an object or a shadow. It was a presence. Something shifted below the surface, too far down for me to make out. My stomach twisted and I stopped swimming, treading water as my eyes strained into the depths. There was nothing visibly there, but I could feel it. A sensation like being watched, like something was studying me from beneath. "Hey," I called out to my friends, trying to hide the unease in my voice. "Can you guys feel that? Like something's down there?" They splashed and joked, completely unaware. I didn't tell them how much I wanted to get out of the water. The longer I stayed, the stronger the feeling grew. It was as if the lake itself had become a living, breathing entity, waiting. I swam back to shore, hurried and shaking off the cold, unsure if what I had felt was real. The others were still laughing, throwing a frisbee, soaking up the last of the day's warmth. I tried to forget about the sensation and told myself it was just my nerves playing tricks. As we started packing up to leave, I noticed something odd in the sand near our stuff. Tracks. Not footprints, though. Drag marks, deep and deliberate, leading from the water toward the woods. My heart stopped as I followed them with my eyes. They disappeared into the trees, where there was nothing but silence. I didn't say anything to my friends. I couldn't bring myself to. As we drove away, I kept looking back at the lake, the sun now fully set, casting a dark, brooding reflection. That night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I kept wondering, what was in that water? And whatever it was it still down there, waiting for us to return? It was a quiet evening, and I had decided to go for a walk along the old, unused rail trail that ran near the edge of town. The trail had been out of service for decades, overgrown with thick underbrush and left to the elements. A relic from another time, it was now little more than a forgotten path through the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trail. I didn't expect to run into anyone. The town had grown quiet in recent years, and I figured it was the perfect time to clear my head. There wasn't much to hear other than the distant sound of the trees rustling in the wind and the occasional creak of an old sign swaying overhead. As I walked further along the trail, a chill started to settle in my bones. It wasn't just the cold air. There was something off about the silence, something unnatural. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. I shook it off, blaming my nerves, and pressed on. About halfway down the trail, I came across an old wooden bench. It was weathered and half-rotted, covered in moss and dirt. I decided to sit for a moment, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The woods around me seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, the wind sharper. I glanced up at the fading light of the horizon, the last hint of twilight vanishing into the thick trees. That's when I heard it, a faint, barely audible whisper carried on the wind. I strained to hear, but there was nothing, just the silence again. Maybe my imagination, I thought. But then, a second whisper, closer this time, like it was coming from the trees behind me. My breath hitched and I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. The woods were still. The trees loomed over the trail like silent sentinels, their branches creaking and swaying. I told myself to calm down, that it was probably just an animal. But deep down, I knew better. There was no animal making those whispers. It was like something, or someone, was trying to call out to me. I tried to walk away from the bench, but the whispers followed. They were louder now, as if they were closing in on me, their words indistinct but somehow menacing. I glanced behind, but there was nothing. Only the trees, silent and watchful. The trail curved ahead, disappearing into the shadows. I kept moving, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to come from all directions now, surrounding me like a dark fog. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was I losing my mind? Or was something out there? Something beyond explanation. Suddenly, I tripped over something in the grass, falling hard onto the dirt path. My hands scraped against the ground as I caught myself. Looking down, I saw it. A small, broken mirror lying face up, shards of glass reflecting nothing but my terrified expression. The whispers turned to a low, guttural whisper, almost like a chant. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but I could feel it resonating in my bones. I scrambled to my feet, my heart thudding wildly in my chest. That's when I saw them. Shadowy figures emerging from the trees. They weren't human, but they moved like people. Tall and hunched, their forms twisted and obscured by the dark. Their eyes glowed faintly, empty and hollow. They didn't speak, but their whispers continued, growing louder. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The shadows moved closer, closing in on me like a wave of darkness. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they stopped. The whispers faded, and the figures vanished into the trees once more. I stood there, breathless, staring into the darkness. When I dared to move again, there was nothing, only the echo of silence. The mirror lay shattered on the ground, its broken glass reflecting nothing but the void of the forest. I didn't stay long after that. I turned around and walked back, never looking over my shoulder again. I've always been a creature of habit. Every Friday night, I'd grab my camera and head to the old train tracks that cut through the woods. It wasn't a destination anyone talked about. It was just a place, quiet and desolate, where I could sit and lose myself in the sounds of the passing trains. That night was no different. I parked my car at the edge of the tracks and made my way through the dense underbrush. The woods stretched on forever, the trees towering above, blocking out any sign of the outside world. I loved the solitude, the way everything seemed to pause out here. No phone signal, no noise, no interruptions, just me and the sound of the tracks stretching into the distance. I set my tripod up, adjusting the camera to capture the faint glow of the distant train lights. As I waited, I realized how dark it had become. The forest had swallowed all light, leaving only the cold glow of the moon casting shadows over the tracks. A slight breeze rustled the leaves, and the distant hum of a train echoed faintly in the distance. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees, a shape, slender and dark, blending into the shadows. I thought maybe it was an animal, but there was something unnatural about the way it moved. Smooth, almost fluid, yet completely wrong. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever it wasn't natural. The figure stepped closer, moving with that same eerie grace, never making a sound. I froze, my finger hovering over the camera. My heart pounded, every nerve on edge. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. As it drew nearer, I could make out more details. It wasn't fully human. The proportions were off. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that no person could. But the most disturbing thing was its face. No eyes, no nose, just a blank, hollow void where a face should have been. I wanted to look away, to grab my camera and run, but something held me there, frozen in place. The figure stood just a few feet from me now, its inky, featureless face staring straight ahead. I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. That's when I realized it wasn't looking at me. It was looking through me. Panic surged through me, but my legs refused to move. It tilted its head as if examining me. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the trees. The silence returned, broken only by the distant rumble of a train far off in the distance. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling as I reached for my camera. The lens trembled as I brought it up, but there was nothing to capture. No figure, no tracks, just the woods. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to process what I had seen. The train came, its light sweeping through the trees, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I waited, and when it passed, I grabbed my tripod and camera, my mind spinning, unable to shake the feeling that something had been watching me. That something was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I never went back. I never believed in the old tales they told about the abandoned factory. It was a relic of the past, a place everyone in town seemed to avoid. Rumors of shadows, whispers, and things that went bump in the night had always seemed like just that, rumors. But I was never one to fear the unknown, at least not until that night. I had always heard stories from my parents and older folks about the factory. how it had been shut down decades ago after a series of strange occurrences, machinery running on its own, lights flickering and whispers echoing through the empty halls. But no one I knew had actually dared to enter it until that night. It was a few weeks after the factory officially closed down for good, and curiosity got the better of me. A few friends and I decided to explore. The building was towering, windows shattered, rusted beams sagging. The front doors creaked as we pushed them open, the air inside heavy with the scent of decay. We stepped cautiously through the dimly lit corridors, flashlight beams cutting through the thick shadows. We wandered through empty hallways filled with old machinery, cracked concrete, and scattered bits of broken equipment. It was like walking through the echoes of the past. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. I started feeling like we were being watched. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just the echoes of our own footsteps. We stopped in what once must have been a break room. A long, faded table sat in the center, surrounded by chairs that looked like they hadn't been used in years. The silence in the room was oppressive. I could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above us, barely hanging on. That's when it started. The faint whispering. It was so soft at first, barely audible, like someone was talking just on the edge of hearing. I froze, trying to make sense of it, but the others didn't seem to notice. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind, the old building settling, but the whispers didn't fade. If anything, they grew louder, more distinct. I took a step toward the hallway, my friends still gathered around the table. The whispers were clearer now, and they sounded wrong. It was like they weren't coming from anywhere. The words were faint, but they seemed to be repeating the same thing over and over, like a distorted echo. Leave. 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 I tried to call out to my friends, but the words caught in my throat. My flashlight flickered, then died completely. Panic gripped me as I scrambled to replace the batteries, but my hands were trembling so badly I could barely manage. "Guys," I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." I heard a low, raspy laugh behind me, cold and hollow. My blood ran cold. I turned around slowly, expecting to see one of my friends, but there was no one there. The whispers had stopped, but the air grew colder. I could feel a presence in the room now, something that wasn't human. I heard it then. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward me from the hall. They weren't my friends' footsteps. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath me. I backed away, stepping carefully until I felt the wall press against my back. The whispers returned, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of dragging footsteps. "Leave. Leave. Leave," they seemed to chant, their distorted voices weaving into the air. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. Suddenly, the lights went out entirely, plunging the room into total darkness. My friends' voices echoed faintly, calling out for me from deeper in the building, but I couldn't find them. I fumbled with my phone, but it was dead. The only sound now was the relentless whispering, growing louder, more urgent. I held my breath, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows, but nothing ever did. Somehow, I found my way out, back through the winding halls, past the echoes of those whispers. My friends never believed me when I told them. To this day, they think I imagined it, that it was just some old factory with nothing more than dust and creaking metal. But I know what I heard, and sometimes, even now, I can still hear the whispers, just faint enough to make my skin crawl. It started as an ordinary Sunday drive through the countryside. I'd packed a few snacks, some music, and planned to spend the day exploring the old back roads, places I hadn't visited in years. The sun was shining, casting long shadows across the fields as I drove along, lost in the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of birds. My destination was a small, forgotten town deep in the woods. It wasn't marked on any maps or GPS. It was one of those places that only showed up if you knew where to look. I had vague memories of visiting there as a kid, but everything had changed since then. The road wound tighter into the trees, and as I drove deeper, the world felt as if it was folding in around me. I was eager for the quiet, for a break from the city, but the stillness of the woods began to feel oppressive, almost too quiet. It was as though the trees were watching, the silence pressing down like a weight. Eventually, I reached the old town, or what was left of it. Time had all but erased it. The town was overgrown with vines, the wooden houses leaning in on themselves, abandoned and forgotten. There were no signs of life, no people, no vehicles, just a faint echo of the past. I parked my car near the edge of what was once Main Street and started walking. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, cracked and covered in weeds. The air smelled damp and musty, like something had been left to rot. I passed the old general store, its windows broken and faded posters peeling away. I peeked inside and saw remnants of a life long gone, dusty shelves, faded signs, and the unmistakable scent of decay. Something about it made my skin crawl, but curiosity drove me forward. I wandered through the town, stumbling over old bricks and rusted metal, feeling as though I was stepping through a memory. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, my footsteps echoing off the crumbling walls, the creak of dry wood, the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, yet unsettling. As the sun began to set, I reached the outskirts of town. I sat on an old stone bench, trying to take in the view of the overgrown fields and the distant horizon. The quiet seemed to stretch forever, the woods pressing closer with each passing moment. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first. A whisper. It wasn't human, but something inhuman. I froze, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, listening, but the woods remained silent except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The whisper grew louder, as if it was circling around me, distant but persistent. I stood, my hands trembling, and turned in a slow circle, searching for the source. The woods were darkening, the last light of day vanishing behind the trees. Then, just beyond the edge of my vision, I saw it. Movement. A shadow, shifting among the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't look human. It was tall, too tall, and its figure twisted unnaturally as if it didn't belong in the world. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The whisper became a soft, eerie chant now, growing louder and more insistent. The figure moved closer, the shadow stretching and twisting as it approached. I could feel its presence, as if it were staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. It was something older, something that had been waiting for a long, long time. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled backward. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but nothing made sense. The figure was no longer a shape, but a dark void, surrounding me in silence and fear. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, the whisper faded. The figure stood still for a moment, then turned, vanishing into the woods as silently as it had come. I stood there, trembling, as the night fully set in. The woods were silent once again, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. That thing, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. I slowly made my way back to my car, heart still racing. As I drove away, I glanced back at the town once more, the memories of the whisper still echoing in my mind. I haven't gone back since. I've always loved the forest. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees, the fresh air, and the quiet that draws me in. So, when my friends suggested a weekend camping trip deep into the woods, I didn't hesitate. It sounded perfect, peaceful, serene, just what we needed to escape from the chaos of city life. We packed up our gear, grabbed some supplies, and hiked several miles into the heart of the forest. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in fallen leaves, but the scenery was breathtaking. As we set up camp, I remember how quiet everything felt. No distant sounds of cars, no faint hum of electricity, just us and the wilderness. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat around, laughing and enjoying each other's company. I had never felt more at peace. But when we decided to turn in, something shifted. That night, I kept waking up, hearing strange noises just beyond the trees. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the occasional hoot of an owl. These were softer, quieter sounds, almost like whispers. I brushed them off at first, telling myself it was just the wind, but something about the tone of those whispers felt wrong. Intimate, almost as though they were meant for someone, not just the forest. The second night, things felt different. I couldn't sleep at all. The forest had gone silent. Not the kind of silence you're used to when you're out in nature, but an unnatural, almost oppressive quiet. There wasn't a single sound from any creature. No crickets, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if the forest had been drained of all life. At one point, I decided to step out of the tent and check the surroundings. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I shone my flashlight into the woods, expecting to see some critters or movement, but there was nothing. Just darkness. I called out to my friends, but my voice felt swallowed by the stillness. Then I saw it. Something standing far off, just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't a person, at least not a normal one. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and it didn't move like a human. Its silhouette was dark, almost blending into the night, but the more I stared, the more I felt like its presence was wrong. The air seemed to pulse around it, and I swear I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. I froze, my breath hitching. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It didn't seem curious, it didn't feel human, it felt watchful in a way that made my skin crawl. I backed away, slowly retreating into the tent, my heart racing. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me flinch, but nothing else came. The next morning, my friends were awake, laughing, acting like nothing had happened. They didn't hear the whispers, didn't see the figure in the woods. When I told them, they just shrugged it off, calling me paranoid. I didn't press the issue. We packed up our gear, leaving the quiet forest behind us, still unsure of what we'd encountered. It wasn't until we were back in town that I realized something truly terrifying. I checked my phone. No service, as expected. But when I scrolled through my pictures from the trip, I froze at what I found. In the photos from the night before, something appeared. A faint, shadowy figure standing among the trees, barely visible but unmistakably there. It wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination. It was real. And somehow, whatever it was, it had been watching us. I don't know what it wanted, and I never want to go back to that place. Some things are better left unseen. It was a quiet evening in my apartment, the kind where the city feels distant despite being just outside the window. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant car passing by. I had just settled in for the night, the blinds drawn and the dim glow of my desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. I wasn't sure how long I'd been sitting there when I noticed something strange. It was faint at first, a whispering sound. Barely audible, like someone was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the wind or some noise from the neighbors. But it wasn't just outside the window. It was inside my apartment. I listened closer, holding my breath. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from any specific direction, but rather seemed to be coming from everywhere. It felt like the walls were alive, the air itself vibrating with those strange, unintelligible sounds. I got up and moved toward the hallway, my footsteps echoing faintly. The whispers followed, as if they were inside my head. I turned on the hallway light, hoping it would stop whatever was making that sound, but the light did nothing. The whispers continued, now more persistent. almost like they were speaking my name. The sound was almost melodic, but there was something eerie about it, something off. I decided to step into my bedroom and close the door behind me. The moment I did, the whispers stopped. It was quiet again, the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, this time, more clear, coming from just outside the door. "Let me in." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't like any sound I've ever heard before. It was low, hollow, almost mechanical, but filled with an unnatural urgency. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my entire body trembling. "Let me in," the voice repeated, louder this time, like it was right outside the door. I could feel the floor beneath me shaking slightly, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. I knew I had to do something. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking as I tried to call the police. The line rang and rang, but no one answered. The phone died, the screen flickering, leaving me in total silence once again. The whispers started again, this time from deeper inside the apartment, coming from the shadows that seemed to stretch across the floor like living things. They didn't make any sense, but they were there, filling the air with a sense of dread that I couldn't escape. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my room, with the door locked, listening to those whispers, until the first light of dawn broke through my blinds. When morning finally came, everything was quiet. No signs of anything strange. My apartment looked the same, as if nothing had happened. But the whispers, they haven't stopped. I still hear them sometimes, late at night when the city noise dies down and the silence takes over. I don't know what they are, but I know they're still there, waiting. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when I decided to go for a drive. I had been feeling restless lately, and the open road seemed like the perfect escape. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my car, and drove aimlessly, taking whatever turns felt right. Eventually, I found myself deep in the countryside, miles from any sign of civilization. The roads twisted and turned, surrounded by nothing but trees and fields. The further I drove, the quieter it became. No cars, no people, just the hum of the engine and the distant chirp of birds. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After a while, I came across an old farmhouse. Its paint was peeling and the windows were dark and empty. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pulled up beside the house, parking a little ways off the dusty driveway. I sat there for a moment, staring at the abandoned building. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't sit right. I decided to get out and take a closer look. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I approached the front door. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface. The house smelled old, like something had been left to rot inside. My breath fogged up the cracked window and I peered inside. It was empty, completely stripped of life. Chairs lay overturned, curtains torn and hanging in tatters. It was as if the house had been waiting for someone to return. As I wandered through the house, a strange feeling settled over me. The air was still, almost too still. It felt as if I wasn't alone. My skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I called out, but no answer came. It was like the world had gone silent, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if something is breathing just beyond it. Upstairs, I found a room at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was slightly ajar, creaking when I pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with faded furniture and more cobwebs. On the wall was a single photograph, worn and faded, its edges curling up. A family stood there, smiling, though their eyes seemed hollow, their grins fake. The photo sent a chill down my spine. Then I heard a sound from below, a faint, distant thud. My heart skipped a beat. I listened, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking through the house. I stood frozen, listening. The footsteps came from downstairs, echoing up the creaking staircase. I should have run, I knew that. But my legs wouldn't move. The fear had paralyzed me. Then I heard it, the sound of something else, a faint whispering voice. I couldn't make out the words, just the soft murmur as if someone was speaking in another language. It came from below, growing louder, as if whatever it was had found its way into the house. Tears filled my eyes as I forced myself to move. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to go back to the front door. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I moved slowly down the stairs, each creak beneath my feet sounding louder than the last. At the front door, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I had never been more afraid in my life. The whispers had grown so loud, they felt like they were in my head. I turned the knob, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the daylight. The house looked different from the outside, somehow darker, more twisted. I expected to see someone standing there watching me, but there was nothing, just the empty fields stretching out before me. The whispering faded, and the silence returned. I drove away without looking back. The house stayed with me, though. The image of that photograph, the whispering voice, it all felt too real. I don't know what I experienced that day, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. The day had started off ordinary, just another lazy afternoon. I decided to explore the old abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place everyone whispered about but no one dared to enter. The house had always been shrouded in mystery, sitting at the edge of the forest like a relic from another time. The locals said strange things happened there, whispers in the night, disappearing pets, shadows in the corners of windows. I parked my car on the gravel path and made my way toward the house. The old wooden planks groaned beneath my feet, each step echoing eerily in the quiet. The front door creaked open without much resistance, revealing a dark, empty interior. Dust covered everything and the air smelled of decay. I walked through the rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. Furniture had been overturned, and old photos lay scattered on the floor, their faces faded beyond recognition. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath my weight. As I wandered deeper into the house, I began to hear something. Faint whispers, barely audible but persistent. I paused, holding my breath, straining to make out what they were saying. It was almost like the house itself was murmuring secrets, as if the walls were alive with memories. I shook off the chill that ran down my spine and pressed on. The whispers grew louder as I reached the top of the staircase. They seemed to be coming from the room at the end of the hall. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed open the door. Inside, the room was bare except for an old mirror standing in the corner. It was cracked, its glass dull and warped. I couldn't look away, compelled by some strange force. As I stared into the mirror, I saw my reflection distort, my face twisting, becoming something wrong. The whispers became screams, louder now, echoing in my ears. I stumbled back, the distorted figure in the mirror now staring at me, its hollow eyes gleaming. I could feel it watching me, not just in the reflection, but in the real world. My breath came in shallow gasps and I backed away from the mirror, tripping over the furniture as I fled the room. As I ran down the hall, I glanced behind me and caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, black and shifting, racing after me. I could hear it breathing, ragged and uneven, closing the distance between us. I burst out of the house, the door slamming shut behind me. The air outside was thick, oppressive, and silent once again. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I've never returned to that farmhouse. The whispers still echo in my ears, and sometimes I swear I see that shadow lurking just at the edge of my vision. Whatever was in that house, whatever was chasing me, It's still there, waiting. It was the kind of evening where the sky seemed to press down on everything, as if it wanted to swallow the world whole. My friends and I had decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned lighthouse, miles from any town, where the cliffs stretched out over the ocean like they were reaching toward the sky itself. The lighthouse had been shut down decades ago, long before anyone could remember. We'd heard rumors that it was haunted, but we didn't believe in that kind of stuff. We just wanted an adventure. The road to get there was narrow, winding, and barely lit by a few flickering streetlights that flickered on and off like they were uncertain of their own purpose. We parked the car at the base of the cliffs and began walking toward the lighthouse. The air smelled of salt and decay, the kind of place where you feel like you've stepped out of time. The lighthouse stood there, looming and skeletal against the darkening sky. Its red brick tower stood like a sentinel, long forgotten, its windows cracked and covered in moss. We reached the entrance, a heavy metal door that creaked open with a groan. Inside, everything was covered in dust. The old lanterns hung from the walls, cobwebs stretched between them. The faint smell of mildew and dampness clung to everything. We walked up the narrow staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The higher we climbed, the darker it got. The dim light from the lanterns barely illuminated our path. I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, whispers, or maybe the creak of an old floorboard. Something to break the silence. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, and the soft shuffle of my friends behind me. Finally, we reached the top. The door at the top of the staircase creaked open, and we stepped out onto the balcony of the lighthouse. The wind hit us, sharp and cold, as we looked out over the cliffs. The ocean stretched out endlessly beneath us. The waves crashed far below, their roar distant and faint. The horizon stretched into nothingness, the darkness blending with the sea. We stood there, taking in the view, laughing and joking. We were miles from civilization, miles from anything that could disturb us. Or so we thought. That's when I heard it. The soft scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor below us. I turned to my friends, but they didn't seem to hear it. I figured it was the wind, some old creaking of the lighthouse settling into the darkness. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. This time, it wasn't below us. It was above. I froze, staring up toward the narrow spiral staircase that led to the top of the tower. The scraping noise was now followed by the faint sound of ragged breathing, labored and slow, like something struggling to draw in air. My hands trembled as I pointed upward. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but my voice was lost in the wind. My friends looked at me, puzzled. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on my mind. But then came the unmistakable sound of a voice, low and cracked, whispering something I couldn't make out. We were alone up there. I knew it. The others insisted it was probably the wind or some animal, but my instincts told me otherwise. I grabbed my friend's arm and whispered, "We need to get out of here." We turned, bolting down the staircase as fast as we could, the sound of our footsteps pounding in our ears. The scraping noise followed us, but it was closer now, louder. It sounded like it was climbing after us. When we reached the base of the tower, the door was still open. But what we saw outside wasn't normal. There was something standing by the car, something too tall, too thin, with its back bent unnaturally. It didn't move like a person. It was more like a shadow, stretching toward us in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, dark, and seemed to burn with a cold, inhuman light. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The others were frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figure turned its head slowly as if observing us, and then started to walk toward us. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't sure what it wanted. Without thinking, we bolted down the cliffside, the figure still behind us. The wind howled louder, but we didn't stop. We didn't stop until we reached the car and drove away. not looking back. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I haven't been able to go near that lighthouse since. Whatever was up there, waiting for us, still lingers in my mind. Some places I've learned are better left untouched,